Welcome to the first panel of the Sawyer Seminar Series on Black citizenship, everybody. We have a very exciting panel for you today. It's going to be a roundtable discussion. So what we're going to do is we're going to have all the panelists introduce themselves and discuss, say a little bit about their work and how it ties into the theme. Then we're going to have a roundtable discussion, and then we're going to do a Q&A with the audience. So I really want to encourage all of you to have questions ready to go. Okay, so the whole idea for this is to be a seminar where you talk, they answer, and we have a conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Professor Hyacinth Miller to do the introductions and get started. Okay, I'll just project. I'll just project, it's fine. Okay, great.
Hello, before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we are currently occupying the land of the fearless warriors of the Niambi Nation. I also want to pay respects to all of our ancestors on whose shoulders we sit, and we can just be silent for about 10 seconds. And 5 seconds. So thank you all for coming. My name is Hyacinth Miller. I am an assistant teaching professor in the departments of Africana Studies and Political Science. And this is a political science panel. So we are prepared to go, political anthropologist who will be political science today. We want you to ask us questions about what Black citizenship is or is not, or how it performs, how it does not perform. And we want you to be as engaged as possible. So with that, I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll start with Dr. Bonilla.
My name is Yarimar Bonilla. I am not a political scientist. I'm a cultural anthropologist and a professor at the City University of New York and the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies.
Hi, everybody. I'm Niambi. I'm a political scientist by training. I'm in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. That's it. Okay. Dr. Johnson.
Hi, I'm Kim Johnson, and I'm a political scientist recovering. And I'm in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University.
Thank you. Hi, it's great to see everybody. I'm Reuel Rogers. I'm also a political scientist by training. I'm still working with that affliction. I'm also affiliated with the African American Studies Program Department at Northwestern University. And it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So to start the conversation, given my political science training, citizenship is the relationship of an individual to its state, right? And so Black citizenship would therefore mean a Black person's relationship to the state, either the state in which they live or the state in which they're from or the state in which they want to visit. So given each of your disciplinary trainings or your past or current research, how would you define Black citizenship? And you can start with Dr. Johnson.
Okay, didn't expect to start. So I have this like massive talk that I wrote because I'm a perfectionist, but I'm also trying to recover from that as well. So I thought I would talk about a little bit about my current book project, which is called Dark Concrete, Black Power, Urbanism, and American Political Development. And in that book, I look at 4 cities: Newark, New Jersey, East Orange, New Jersey, Oakland, California, and East Palo Alto, California. And I was really animated by thinking about this moment that happens, particularly after the 1960s, when Black becomes urban, urban becomes Black. And what does it mean for a city to become a Black city?
Yep.
Nope. Okay. So So thinking through and thinking about these different spaces, and I should sort of also acknowledge that for a while I lived in Montclair, New Jersey, which is its own kind of space. I see all these nods. And so I was thinking about and came up with this idea that I called Black urban citizenship or Black power urbanism, which is thinking about how do we think about this moment from, say, 1950 to 1965, which is the sort of era of urban renewal. And we know that urban renewal essentially destroys Black communities across the nation. It destroys Black Newark. It destroys Puerto Rican Newark. And so how do we think about this process of repairing and reconstructing a city? And so what I came up with is this idea of Black power urbanism, which is a constellation of ideas and organizations and institutions which sought to remake cities into just and emancipatory spaces. And so for each city, I look at the ways in which across what I call sort of three pillars of Black power, housing, education, and policing, to figure out what's happening during this puzzling. It's almost like putting together this puzzle, this kind of tinker toys. How do we sort of reconnect and reconstruct a city that is for everybody, as opposed to a city in which people are displaced and dispossessed? And so that's I think what my book is about. I was going to start this presentation with talking about the Crispus Attucks Parade. Do we even know what this is? So it's the African Heritage Day Parade. It starts in 1966 and 1967. At one point, they pull like a Nike missile as part of the sort of parade route. And I'm thinking, why call it Crispus Attucks? Why have a parade in Newark in 1966 named after Crispus Attucks? And what I sort of been thinking about is the way in which this is this moment where it's the collapse of liberal integrationism and this sort of moment of creation of a Black city. And so this parade is this kind of space in which Blacks are kind of asserting this like new right to Newark. And they're using this historical figure of Crispus Attucks both to sort of signal a connection to the sort of lineage of American citizenship, of sort of liberal integrationism, even as surrounding this parade site, there are all these contestations over housing, over education, over policing. One great quote is, so there's a conflict over Barringer High. Its renovation is being done by an all-white crew, or at that point, a majority white high school. And so people are like, wait a minute, you're using this urban renewal funds, this sort of federal funding to basically recreate a segregated space. And also you're like not hiring Black people. Why are you not hiring Black people? This is, the school system at this point is 60 or 70% Black and Puerto Rican. And so there's a protest, it makes the New York Times, and this is kind of the first kind of moment that sort of this Black rebellion appears, and the police and the white construction folks kind of unite together to basically hit and assault the protesters. So George Richardson, longtime Newark political figure, goes to the then mayor and says, you need to not do this. And by the way, we need a civilian review board. And the mayor says to him, and I'm probably getting this quote not quite right. The mayor says to him, I am the police is me. Yeah. So it is this kind of, so I use this moment to really think about, how one creates Black citizenship, and how to sort of create an idea about Black citizenship that moves away from the idea of Blacks as these sort of temporary inhabitants of urban spaces. Sort of the narrative is that, Blacks move from the north, from the south to the north. There's sort of these rural peasants who can't quite handle urban life. And I'm like, no. In fact, like Crispus Attucks, we've always been in the north, and we've always been in Newark. I say they royally, but and so I guess that's my project really, is to sort of think about thinking about citizenship and reconnecting it and making it about a contestation over space.
Thank you for that, yes.
Sure, I want to read that one. Yeah, that sounds really, really, really good. So I come at the question of Black citizenship maybe a little bit differently. In political science, there's a heavy emphasis on political behavior, and my first book focused on how Black immigrants become Black citizens and how anti-Black racism complicates that process. And the resources to which they turn to navigate racism, the case I focused on was New York, thinking about Black urban citizenship and how Black immigrants are complicating the notion of Black urban citizenship. And one of the key insights from the book, I'd like to think, is that Black immigrants have a couple different options for responding to anti-Black racism when they encounter it. I mean, they're not shocked by it. It's not like Blacks in the Caribbean don't know what anti-Black racism is. They encounter it there. But how you navigate it is very different when you come into a city where there's an established Black political establishment, if you will, and what that means. And so this morning, I think Claudine Rakim in one of the exchange was talking about Black immigrants as representatives of US Blacks. And that becomes really fraught for Caribbean immigrants in New York, I discover in my book. And some look to what they call their exit option, the option they have to return to their home countries when they encounter racism. They think very few actually make use of the exit option, but they often rely on it, at least psychologically, psychically, when they encounter racism. Others, however, turn to the resources that native-born Blacks have already established in Black civic spaces, Black associational spaces, and develop a really sort of keen sense of linked fate consciousness with other Blacks, US-born Blacks, if you will. And they have a different kind of response to the discriminatory barriers they encounter. And so moving on from that work, I've been working on a new project that's mostly experimental with a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, mostly at Latunji. And we fielded this experiment a couple of years ago with over 500 native-born Blacks. And the key question for us there is, what qualifies a foreign-born Black person to represent native-born Blacks? That's the crux of the matter, and whether their foreign-born status, their nativity status is disqualifying, or it's seen as a boon, or are they expected to prove their connection to US Blacks by something more than their vulnerability to discrimination. In my first book, I found that that was a key area where native-born and foreign-born Blacks connected, right? They're all vulnerable to discrimination. But do you need something more to be seen as representative of US Blacks? And so we've only done some of the preliminary analyses on the experimental data. And not surprisingly, we find that native-born Blacks tend to prefer other native-born Blacks as representatives. And I should tell you a little bit about how we designed the experiment. There are 4 conditions. And in one condition, it's a African-American candidate who is contesting an election against a foreign-born Black candidate. Another one where the African-American candidate is up against a white mayoral candidate. Another one where the Black immigrant is up against a white candidate, and so on. So that's the set of conditions. We find that typically native-born Blacks prefer other native-born Blacks as their representative. We're not sure what the mechanisms are there, whether this is evidence of just frank ethnocentrism, which isn't all that surprising. Is there a hint of nativism, thinking about Professor Carter's work? Is this an issue of who you trust? And what would it require to signal that you're deserving of the trust to be representative? And we ask the question about representation in a number of different ways. We don't just ask about vote choice. We ask who you're willing to donate to. We want to test the intensity of the preference, who you see as representative of other Blacks. And then we have some open-ended questions at the end of the experiment where we ask them to explain their answers. And so we're looking through those responses to see if we see evidence of any of these potential explanations. But one of the most striking results that we find is that African Americans or native born Blacks who express high levels of linked fate with other Blacks are much more likely to endorse foreign born Blacks as leaders, right? And so what I'm wondering now is what linked fate is doing in those circumstances. Is it moderating the impulse toward ethnocentrism? Is it something different? We don't know yet. It's a bit of a black box, but I think that's the next step. So once Caribbean immigrants or African-born immigrants become American, right? Then what does it mean for the supply chain for Black leadership to become much more diversified? And I think this is an interesting moment in Black politics where that supply chain is much more diasporic than it used to be, but it then means that it complicates decision-making among Black voters. Who do you choose? Oftentimes, there are an array of Blacks from which you choose, and who's seen as the best representative of Blacks in the country. And so you look at, for instance, the coverage of Barack Obama in the early days, or Kamala Harris more recently, and how Black media in particular covered their foreign-born ancestry, and then how they responded sometimes to skepticism, particularly Obama in the early days about whether he is Black enough, those kinds of questions. And so for us, I think that is a really fraught terrain, worth exploring and looking at what foreign-born Blacks do to overcome this, because oftentimes they're facing a heavily Black electorate that's predominantly native born. Some may have ties to other places, but many do not. And is this a hurdle to their leadership ambitions and aspirations? So that's where the work is headed. And I think that in and of itself complicates the notion of Black citizenship when we think about its increasingly diasporic elements. And so I'm happy to discuss this more. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for this question, because I think it's a hard one, right? Because I don't think it's a thing, right? I can't give you a definition of Black citizenship, but I think it's definitely context. I think it's negotiation. I think for me, I think about Black citizenship as migration, right? Broadly considered. And I think my work starts in rural Black communities, because that's the Black communities that my mother came from. I didn't grow in the rural community, but my mom did, my grandparents were. And so what does it mean for movement, right? I think that's a central thing that to me unites Black citizens more generally, right? If we think about Blackness as a place that you can belong to, as the idea that you can belong to, as a community you can belong to. That has, to me, as a core part of it, movement. Even for Black Americans who we think of as sort of native born and domestic, right? Like my family are from North Carolina, but I have family in New Jersey. I have family in New York. My grandparents were the strange ones who reverse migrated. They left Baltimore, didn't like it, and went back to the South. And my grandmother's like, you can't keep conquering. Right, so it's one thing to be poor in the city, it's another thing to be poor we can actually break something, get something, right? And so part of what I think about when I think about Black citizenship, right? They were talking earlier, Dr. Rankin was talking earlier about the sort of administrative title of citizen, right? But if we know anything about the US, we know that Black people don't really become citizens until 1965. So most of the time that Black people are in America, they are not citizens. They might be citizens of state, but they're not citizens of the nation. So when Black people are talking about themselves, Black Americans and Native born Black, just to, be clear, they're largely speaking about themselves as non-citizens. And so even when we think about the Great Migration, I think we need to put that in context with larger kind of immigrant flow questions that we're having, right? Because Black people are not just leaving the Caribbean and the continent of Africa to come to the US. Black people in Kentucky are going to Detroit, right? Black people in Mississippi are going to California. Black folks in Arkansas are going to Chicago or St. Louis. Black folks in South Carolina and North Carolina are going to New York. So there are all of these things that are happening. So I think about Black citizenship is a series of diasporas, if you will, right? Because most of us probably, they were asking where you from and that kind of thing, can say we're from New Jersey, but most of us are out of country cousins. right? Both of us had somebody somewhere else. Both of us spent our time. I grew up in Maryland, but I spent my summers in North Carolina, in Warren County, right? So when I think about what Black citizenship means, I think about migration as a tool, right? It's not just a state of being, right? I'm an immigrant or I migrated to some other place. It's also a tool. And it's always, to me, a search to get more free, right? To be self-actualizing and all that means, right? And so when I think about Black citizenship, I think about movement as integral, right? To Black people trying to make and remake themselves all the time. And we're talking about it even now, right? About Black people thinking about where they can go in the world to get that freedom. So we've seen a lot of people toying with moving back to the continent. I know several people, right? Some moved to South Africa, some moved to Ghana, some moved to Gambia, right? Because they're trying to get that freedom. Now, of course, that's always a class discussion, and I think that's an important part of that discussion when we talk about that. But when you think about Black people as citizens in this space in particular, I think you're talking about people that were never contemplated as American, not as the archetypal American, right? I mean, self-possession, right? That's sort of one of the key ingredients about who gets to become a citizen. And if you are an enslaved people or people who are next or adjacent, right, to that institution, then you are not self-possessing. It can't be a citizen. There's no way to really convert that status. It does change, right? People contest, people fight, but a lot of people also move. Right, so that strategy that Dr. Rogers talked about of exit is also existent for Black Americans. And I think for me, when I think about my work, I'm always thinking about what don't we know about Native born Blacks? Sometimes I feel like we got it all figured out, particularly political science. It's like they're Democrats, you know, they kind of live in like 5 places. And that's all we need to know, right? But I think there's a lot to find there. And so even my newer project, which was that, I forgot who asked the question, I didn't see who asked the question earlier about Haitian V14, is about Haitian refugees. And what does that tell us about the possibilities of Black citizenship in this place, right? And so I'm always thinking about, you know, Black citizenship as maybe not belonging to a particular nation or place and belonging to this sort of larger conversation that we need to be having about whiteness, right? To Dr. Rankin's early point about anti-Blackness as a global phenomenon and what that means for how Black people have to, as a global community, move and form and reform communities to try to stay involved, right? Those dehumanizing aspects of white supremacy and global anti-Blackness.
I think now's the perfect time for me to come in because I feel like kind of a citizenship denied is very much, you know, what I work on. My work is about Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican. When asked to speak about Black citizenship, I wasn't sure if I was being asked to speak about Black Puerto Ricans and their relationship to the Puerto Rican state, or if to think about how the Puerto Ricans in the 50 states are racialized. So of course, when I asked the answer was both. And so I never used the concept Black citizenship myself, but the department that I'm in at Hunter College originally was called the Department of Black and Puerto Rican Studies. And so clearly, especially in New York and the East Coast, there's been a relationship and kind of, you know, alignment of these categories and a lot of public policy that was put into place that affected Puerto Ricans was policy that was targeted specifically towards Black and Puerto Rican populations because of the level of governmentality, at least in New York. These were often thought in tandem. That has shifted and the name of my department shifted in that now it's Department of Black, Department of African, Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latin and Latino studies, right? So it's become like, instead of being Black and Puerto Rican, it's like Africana and then Puerto Rican being lumped into Latino as if, you know, these were the two separate. So I think, you know, to start there, you know, there is a tension in thinking about Blackness among Puerto Ricans. In the last decade, there's been a rise of Afro-Puerto Rican and Afro-Latino scholars in general that have been, calling attention to the fact that the Puerto Rican Latino experience is often narrated from a non-Black place, from a mestizo place or a white Latino space, right? And so there's been an increasing call to center Black Latino voices and experiences in our analysis. At the same time, one project that I did with my colleague Isar Godreau is that we started to track shifting racial identities in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And so for a long time, the census in Puerto Rico was different from the rest of the 50 states, and it didn't have a race question. Because the Puerto Rican government has other Latin American governments, and we're not a country, right? Had this idea of, color blindness, of racial democracy, cosmic race, we're all the same, etc., and then an attempt to kind of promote that idea in a way that silenced the particularity of Afro-Latino. So I think it's 2010, the census changes and they start bringing back the race question to Puerto Rico. And then suddenly everyone was white. It was like 70–80% white. And you might have heard of it because it was very much in the news. Like, what are the Puerto Ricans thinking? Like, over there. And so part of what my colleague and I try to think about is, we all know that race is a social construct. And that racial identity is in part produced by the state through bureaucratic rituals of identification. And so I think what we saw with the census data was what happens when you have not created a ritual of racial identification. And so that folks, saw this form and they're not used to filling it out. Obviously, anti-Blackness is part of that, but it's not the only part of it. And so we then have been tracking how that has changed, and with each new census, the population that identifies as white has been shrinking in Puerto Rico, and the population that identifies as Black has been rising, but it doesn't compensate for the decline in whiteness. What has really grown is people marking off the category of other. They identify as Latino, as Puerto Rican, and then they identify as other or mixed race. As anthropologists, we're like, well, we want to know what's going on when people mark these boxes, right? And so we did a survey where we asked people just point blank, what's your racial identity? And they would ask us, well, what do you have there on the box? And we're like, no, there's no boxes. And this is the thing, I think in the US, we're constantly being asked to fill out forms, to check out boxes. We constantly encounter our racial, or the demand for us to identify racially. Puerto Ricans don't encounter this. And so many would say, well, that's a racist question. Like, no, just how do you identify? And so what we found, we also was with a team of students, and we started to notice first that there were these long pauses, there were hesitations, there were mumbling, people and they would ask for indication, some would reject the question. But then we started tracking that by also using a color scale and looking at, how did that relate to the color that the surveyor identified the person with. And so what we found was that the people who responded most quickly, unhesitantly, were those who had a darker skin color and who identified as Black. And so our conclusion is, we describe this as a kind of unhesitant Black. They don't hesitate, they know they're Black, because even if they haven't been given forms to fill out their whole life, they've had other encounters with police, or with, various institutions and social discrimination in their lives. So they have been racialized, right? We also found that folks who are very light skinned tended to answer a little bit quicker, and it was those kind of in between shades that had all this kind of mumbling. But even among those who identified as white, we noticed that they wouldn't just say white. They would say that white Latino, white Puerto Rican, white skin Puerto Rican. And so we call that kind of qualified whiteness, because we think the way that Puerto Ricans, even when they identify as white on the census form, they understand that there's this other whiteness of which they're shut out, right? And so, and some people would even say, well, here I identify as white, but over there, they call me this, or they call me that, or I put that on those forms, right? So that's one aspect, and we notice that there's this decline in people identifying as white that has parallel Puerto Rico's economic crisis and Hurricane Maria, the imposition of a fiscal control board, the kind of crude realization or kind of overt acceptance that we're a colony. And so we think that acceptance of that colonial status has also influenced how people identify racially, because there's not white colonial subjects. So I think that realization is also building into that, and we're hoping to do a kind of third iteration of the study to see those trends. So I don't normally use the concept of Black citizenship. What I use is non-consensual citizens, unwilling citizens, impossible citizens, because I think in many ways that's what Puerto Ricans are, and we don't really fall into either native or foreign born because we are foreign in a domestic sense, right? So we're always American, but always not American, right? But in some ways that citizenship is what unwilling and non-consensual citizenship sometimes is used to set us apart from other Latino groups, even though at the same time we're imagined as distinct from African Americans or from other ethnic minorities in the United States. So the challenge, I think now, in terms of the census, there's now a big debate because they're trying to shift the question back again to instead of there being two questions of what is your ethnicity, and then if you're Latino, what is your race? They want to shift the question to what is your ethnicity or race. And so that would make it so that Latinos could just put that they're Latino and not mark any racial category. And so a lot of Afro-Latinos are sounding the alarm and saying, well, we want to identify racially. And those who propose this change, they say, well, you still can, there's still like an extra box for you to add a sub-identity. But what they're saying is that so many Latinos who are playing this colorblind game, and saying, well, I'm not Black, I'm not white, I'm some other thing, they're gonna be able to kind of skirt that, moment of identification on the census. So I'm part of a working group that's trying to think through how to address this issue. So I guess the other part that I have to say, I just, in thinking especially about the commentaries about, the native born Black and the foreign born Black, my dissertation chair, my advisor, Reuel, at one point he advised me to stay a foreigner, to always think in relationship to this nation in a kind of forward way, to not assimilate its racial categories, its kind of ways of being, and to hold those as objects of interest rather than assimilate them as internal structures. And so I think now I'm running a decolonization study group with a group of journalists, scholars, and artists, trying to think about the question of decolonization for Puerto Rico and what would a decolonized Puerto Rico look like. And there's a million aspects to that group, but one of them that we've been thinking about is what kind of citizenship do we want to create in a decolonized Puerto Rico? How do we want to imagine our belonging, our form of belonging, our entanglements to the US, to our neighbors? How do we want to, deal with also the foreign-born populations within Puerto Rico, the Haitian community, the Dominican community, the Cuban community, and also the growing migrants coming from the US. Of course, they're not called migrants, they're called expats. And how do we want to put boundaries on who belongs, who doesn't, who has a say, and who doesn't have a say, and how do we want to do that without replicating Eurocentric notions of belonging and exclusivity? And so I think that is one of the major questions that we have, where we're like, well, do we even want to have a Puerto Rican citizenship, or do we want to imagine a citizenship of the Americas, right, and opening up our borders, and how to not replicate the kind of models of citizenship that are based on exclusion. The Puerto Rican citizenship has always been a kind of exclusion of within the nation. So those are just some of the questions that we're trying to think through.
Well, thank you for that. So there are a few words that came up for me as each of you spoke. These words were exiting, othering, mobilities, reconstruction, diaspora, and native born. For me, when I hear native born, I'm not quite sure what that means because, using the anecdote of my personal story, I was born in the US, but not to US parents. So would I be native born? And because of that complication, I'm tending toward using the term generationally African American. And that comes with its own complexities. But also, I noticed that everyone spoke from a US vantage point in terms of what this Black citizenship is while using the term diaspora. So if we were to actually include our Afro-European brethren and our continental African citizens and our Brazilian sisters and brothers and theys, does that then change your formulation of what you consider to be Black citizenship, or does that conform to what you've just shared about Black citizenship?
For me, the only reference point that I have for Black citizenship was Haiti, right? So the idea that, okay, this is a citizenship that's based on Blackness instead of whiteness. So whereas in the US, really different groups that have fought to be recognized as citizens, what they've been fighting to be recognized is as white. And so I think that is a reference point for our group too, in thinking about how do we want to think about citizenship. How can we model the image for this place and time, right? But thinking with that.
So can I push back on that though, this idea of people fighting to be recognized as white? In an administrative capacity, I don't think they want to be recognized as white, right? Although there are some episodes of that. Because when I think about this, and I think that's a very good question, because I do think Black Americanness takes up a lot of space. I'm Americanist first, so that's why the US is central to me, but I don't think it has to be. I think there have been lots of examples where Black people talk more broadly about who they are as a people across space. And so that was my point about, you can think about Blackness as a place of belonging, not necessarily a nation-bound argument. But what I think, at least when I read the historical record, when I think about Black people who are talking about why they want to be citizens, it's not always proximity to whiteness that they want. It's, we built this place owes us. So it's not, I want to replicate always the misogyny, the patriarchy, and all the other exclusions. We paid too much already, so that America owes a debt. And of course, there are problems, but I think part of it is maybe trying to speak back to America in a language that it understands. And America understands citizenship. America understands revolution. America understands violence, right? Very well. And I think that's why that citizenship conversation happens so much. But I think about, at least when I'm reading sort of what folks are saying in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, even in the 18th century, right? Is like, is this what we want? And is there a way to rehabilitate this space? I don't think that question has ever been settled, right? I don't think people who call themselves citizens in this place or any other place that has been colonized or otherwise touched, right, by this colonial project have ever settled the question about whether we can rehabilitate what is. But the other possibility of being left out fully of what that place has to offer is also not usually an option. So I think the Black citizenship question is a very real one. I think it's an ongoing one. I think again, we see those debates in reparation circles, right? Where people are talking about a real kind of monetary and material transfer, right? And the only way to kind of do that is to establish standing. And the way to do that is via citizenship. And that's a problematic, and all kinds of things. And then I think, there are some people who really do want to be part of the nation state. And so for those people, how do they do that? How do we do that in a way that respects that desire to want to be a part, whether the US or the UK or any other place that Black people might find themselves? I think that's a really hard question, because I do agree with you, right, that whites have often set the table for what can be. And even when you look at sort of Black revolution, right, even when you look at some of the language of the Haitian revolution, that is done in very European type of language, right? The way that they talk about what it is, the project that they're doing. I'm not saying that they're replicating what Europe is doing, but I think, the interminable problem that we often have is having to come back and use the register, right, of the people that would oppress. And how do you move out of that? I think it's a really interminable kind of life.
Yeah, I co-sign on all that. I have a small footnote, and the way you use the language of establishing standing in these debates about reparations, that becomes very vexed quickly when you raise the question about your relationship to the state, because then some people think immediately in terms of who's descended from American slavery specifically. That's how you establish standing. And that becomes really fraught. And so I like this idea, this notion of thinking about Black citizenship in more global terms. When you do, it sets those kinds of questions aside, because in a way, that question about standing when you're descended from American slavery, it reinscribes some of the very problems that sort of this idea of, okay, how do we reimagine the American project? How do we reimagine liberalism, right? I mean, that's the question. And also capitalism, right? Because the reparations debate is, I think for me, uncomfortably tethered to an investment in capitalism and the wage structure. And I think if we think in terms of global citizenship, I find the way you talked about your project in Puerto Rico and global citizenship and tying it to this idea of anti-colonialism, I think in some ways that's a lot more generative and sometimes a more generative way of bridging some of these divides that start to show up quickly when you have these debates about standing.
And let me be clear,
Yeah.
right? I didn't mean standing in the sense of like for the
Yes, I do.
slavery.
Yes, I knew what you meant.
I mean,
Yeah,
multiple
yeah.
reparations claims, but let me be clear, I think there are multiple ones.
That's right.
I don't think there's a singular
I agree.
one emanating from
Yeah,
a slave. But
That's,
yeah, I
that's
think you're
exactly
absolutely
right,
right.
yeah.
So I'm gonna like take a turn towards the urban, which is that, and think about this idea of mobility and freedom. So I sit in New York City, yay, and I'm a New Yorker by choice. I tell native born New Yorkers, my favorite show when I was growing up in California was Welcome Back, Kotter. And I was like, oh my God, I want to live in New York City. And they look at me like, okay. But I think about, why do we have cities, right? There are economic issues, all these sort of things, but it is the idea that, for me, leave a rural place where people are into business. Like it is the idea of freedom. I mean, so I am half and half, native born father and a mother who is from Panama. I go to take my kids back to visit, and we go to one of the towns that she lived in along the canal. That's literally they call Oats in the Bush. Language. And it's this little town with like wooden sidewalks. And I like start to like kind of hyperventilate, like, oh my God, I can't even imagine living here. Thank God you married my father, you got divorced. But anyway, but thank goodness for that, right? And so I think about cities as these places of freedom and reinvention. And Celia Hartman talks about this as well, that, you know, it is a migration, right? That she's talking about these young women who move to the cities because it is a place where they can sort of carve out this life of joy and freedom, however constrained that it should be. So I kind of want to say that, you know, recognize that there's lots of different kinds of migrations. And then to kind of go back to, you know, my other half, which is, so in Panama, there are two cities, Panama City and Colón. Panama City's doing quite well. It's fabulous. It's like Miami. And Colón is now the Black city. It is disinvested, it is considered dangerous, it's scary. It is literally crumbling, even though the architecture itself is quite beautiful and literally built by Afro-Brazilians. And so I think this idea of Blackness and Black citizenship tied to place, about the ability to be who you want to be, the ability to create the community that you want to create, and the idea that you can't have, that you have to be able to kind of, if not be in possession of yourself, at least be in possession of the place so that you can work with others to achieve whatever it is that you think is the life.
Thank you for that. And one final question before I open it up to the, well, two, moderator privilege. So, one question is, as we are really in the 21st century, how should we begin to disentangle or unravel citizenship? Because based on what everyone has shared, it's not quite working for Black and other citizens, right? So is there another word that we should be using? Is there another way that we should be thinking or teaching about citizenship that properly captures the Black mobility or the Black experiences diasporically? So that's question number one. And question number two, given Black people's experiences in having to navigate, negotiate different spaces, how have Black people, Black citizens in their quest for citizenship help other citizens who are Black become citizens? So this is directly tied to your comment about refugees and your comment about Puerto Ricans and your Panamanian experience. Because Black people have helped other Black people become citizens without quite being citizens themselves. So I guess I'm wanting to learn more about, you don't have this thing that you want, but you're helping other people that look like you obtain it. And what does that look like and how has that happened? So those two questions, thank you.
I would say very big question.
That is huge.
Well, I mean, I always, there's your point about, thinking about other things and say not quite working is an understatement. But I do think, what are the markers of success? If it's administrative, like here, you are either in or you're out, then yes, it's working, right? But in terms of what we think it means to be a citizen of someplace, it doesn't have to be US, but there are things that happen, right? You get privileges in certain communities, right? That come with being a citizen. And I think you can turn on the night news, you can see all the ways that is failing. And I think this is to this larger point about sort of what does Blackness mean, because certainly Dr. Roberts' book and others, right, just saying, oh, well, I'm not from here, doesn't give you the cover that it right on the Diallo after right, it's called the same. But is there another word? I'm sure there is. I don't have it yet, but I do think there is a language of partiality that should somehow be read into this, right? Because I think because citizenship is not magic, right? It doesn't make your life better. It doesn't mean that, your salary is going to get higher. You're going to have an easier time buying a house and being able to go to college and doing all the other things that it needs to put together a life for yourself and however you imagine it. So I think there is another word. I don't know what it is. I don't know, I'm thinking about therapy, right? In particular about these sort of dual planes of sort of belonging, right? Either as being seen as a kind of person that is in the family, right? And then the foreigner, right? That's always going to be the foreigner. And then this sort of act of superiority and inferiority. And to kind of like civic ostracism and all this other stuff. So I don't know if that's the direction to move, but I absolutely think there can be and probably should be other terms to talk about. To your earlier point when you started, right? How Black people globally have related to the state, whichever state that is. And then to your second question, about Black people helping other people become citizens. I think Haiti doesn't get enough credit for being that first place, right? That Black people could see themselves as fully realized, actualized beings, in the way that we think of when we think of a place. And so when you see people like Jane Polly and others saying, come here, right? Become citizens. That is a way that Black people are helping other Black people become citizens. Jane Fortan is putting Black people on both and saying, hey, let's try this West African deal. I mean, now they all die. mostly, and come back. That happens, right? Mary and Chad Carey is telling Black people, come to Canada, because America is not going to do for us what we imagine it can do. I mean, I think they're all episodes, but then of course, you know, you have the George Padmores and other things, come here, right? You have Kwame Nkrumah saying, Black people, come here, you can be a citizen here. So I think there are lots of examples of Black people talking to each other across the world, saying, come to this place, Mexico, right? Come here, this is a possibility, come to wherever, right? That Black people had a really dense network of folks talking back and forth about the possibility of living other places. And then, of course, you know, when you think about currently, right? I mean, we have Baji and others that are helping Haitian Bridge Alliance that are doing that kind of work of trying to, if not directly lead people to citizenship, some sort of protected status, and trying to create equity, whatever that looks like in this space, right, of international human rights. And I think, you know, but that would be my short answer.
Yeah, I have a question for Professor Carter. Based on that response, because this morning when we got the question about Haitian deportees, I was a little disappointed that we didn't dwell on it a little longer, because I thought it was a very important question. Because if I understood the question correctly, what she was asking is, why does the narrative about Black excellence elide those kinds of experiences that have to do with undocumented Black body immigrants, right? What happens with those? And one question I went up to her because I practically levitated up. When she asked the question, I thought it was so good and I thought it would lead to a longer conversation. But why it's so important, I think, is because there is the project of agenda setting, right? When we think about what Black citizenship means, what it is, there's a process of agenda setting that happens within Black politics. And the question to me that always looms large in my mind is, what gets included and what gets excluded? And I think the question there was, why is this excluded? Why does that not have a place of priority if there is a unified Black political agenda? Where is that question? I thought that was a question, and I think when those questions get put on the agenda squarely, then our notion of what Black citizenship is expands, right? It becomes more inclusionary, which is what I think you're getting at. And there's a way in which your idea of sort of migration and movement and sort of, you're always sort of headed toward a destination, it provides a level of insight that I think is pretty important for when it gets to those questions about sort of how do we imagine a Black political agenda that is capacious enough to hold all of these interests and these problems and these puzzles. I think that's quite important. And so, I mean, that's all I gotta say about it. But I do think agenda setting is really important, and too many of these issues, because I was shocked that there wasn't more of a, these are, and Niambi knows about that. I mean, Dr. Carter. I mean, is working on these very issues, and yet they don't get the attention they probably deserve. When we think about, there's a way in which when people talk about the contemporary Black political agenda, there are important issues that have to do with policing and so on. But think about the violence. I mean, Dr. Johnson and I were talking about this morning when we had the exchange about those images of those ICE officers literally whipping these Haitian Black bodies, you know, from these horses. I mean, it conjures so many images that should resonate for African Americans who are descended from slavery in this country, and yet it didn't percolate upward the way so. And that too is about policing and policing the Black body and anti-Black police violence, state violence, and yet it's not on the list. It's just not. At least that's my impression, and I think that is a silence that a reimagined Black citizenship cannot tolerate.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm not sure if I can involve with it. I think what I do want to say is that, and this is where I'm like, on my part of political science hat, which is that to be someone in a state of abjection is terrible. To be someone in a state of abjection, stateless, is indescribably worse. So I think on a kind of a visceral level, I'm not willing to give up this idea of citizenship as connected to the idea of the state. Because why, I mean, the problem of refugees and is that you're stateless, right? You don't have something at your back for your status eject or whatever it is. So I think and this might be another dodge, is to sort of think about perhaps citizenship not as this kind of very thin kind of definition that's rested on, did you like do the ceremony or were you born, on the soil, but think of it kind of in a more salient, multiple kinds of citizenship, political citizenship, social citizenship, etc. Because I think that kind of gets into, at least for the state of Blackness, the different ways in which Black people, individuals intersect with the state, and the different kinds of political configurations that occurs under these different kinds of citizenship configurations or regimes or whatever you'd like to call it. So I'm not really ready to back away from citizenship. I mean, as long as we have states, then we kind of need citizenship for administrative purposes. But I think, again, super problematic. But I think that migration itself and the sort of thinking about family flows and reunification, I mean, to me, that is creating new kinds of citizenship. That you're like, hey, I found this place, and in this moment, in this place, we can sort of craft an alternative and otherwise. And so come with us, join us here in this kind of otherwise space.
So I agree that we need a kind of a reformed notion of citizenship, and it's something that I say, at least we need to understand that citizenship is not something you either have or don't have. It's not like being pregnant. Like there's all these different spectrums and ways that are denied, almost, quasi, etc. So that's one aspect. The other thing is that within Puerto Rican circles, we've been talking a lot about how to disinvest from U.S. citizenship, because in some ways it's what has kept us from being free, right? That investment in being fully recognized by the empire, right? And after Hurricane Maria, a lot of people would, voice their outrage at how Puerto Ricans were being treated by saying, but they're U.S. citizens. And the thing is like, well, what if they weren't? Like, does that mean like the nations at the border? Like, I mean, is it only citizenship that allows you humanity, right? And so I think maybe a disinvestment from that as the claim making model, right? But rather to a different kind of belonging, relationality, entanglement, also historic debts, to communities that have been extracted from, right? And that don't have to be given a kind of a legality, right? So I would say that in terms of thinking about the spectrums of citizenship, like there are, there are those who are disenfranchised citizens, there's the denied citizens, but there's also the unauthorized, the undocumented, which are different also again from like the expat, right? And I've interviewed a lot of US people from the 50 states moving to Puerto Rico for tax purposes, etc. And I said, well, you realize that now you're being disenfranchised, like you can't vote for the president anymore, and that's something that, like, a lot of people wish they had that, right? And they said, well, that's not how I influence elections, right? So, so I think that the idea that piece of paper, that passport, is what gives you, influence in a community is also itself a lie, so there's people who influence and have access and have rights without having those pieces of paper.
In DC is like Puerto Rico in that respect, right? It's about those rights. Which is why that.
Right.
Made a big difference, right? In terms life, but you know, I think with underneath your question, I mean, we are all trying to excavate this, right? It's this idea of these administrative categories and not doing any work. Right, that they're just out there, they don't mean, they're benign, they're just things, right? And it's like, citizenship is that always, you know, to your point, Dr. Lee's point about exclusionary, kind of citizenship, right? It's not always just a state of being, it does actual work. And a lot of that work is really destructive and, nasty, work. Especially when we talk about the way we treat migrants.
Well, thank you all. At that point, I would like to open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions for our esteemed panel.
Thank you.
Mic check.
Give us 1 second.
You can use this one.
Oh, yes. I'm Erica G. Baptiste. Thank you for speaking with all of us today. I appreciate it. Somebody touched on my question earlier, but I'm still gonna repeat it. It's a two-parter. My question is like, is citizenship less meaningful if people within a society, like people who hold a greater space within a society, control that space, but have difficulties in exercising like those rights? And if we can define that as valid, like what should Black people or Puerto Rican people or other people of the diaspora aspire to as an alternative to that sentiment?
Any takers?
I mean, I think it's interesting to think about. Can you have citizenship without rights, or you have rights without? And I think that at least in the US case, you can have both, right? You have a certain set of rights that are not connected to citizenship. And I mean, I think when I was thinking earlier, it might be someone in this room. I think I was looking at someone's website. But so I'm at a university that prides itself on being a global university, creating global citizens. And who's allowed to be a global citizen and who's not? So if certain people are not allowed to go to the Abu Dhabi campus, and certain people from the Abu Dhabi campus cannot ever come into the United States. So what does that mean to have a global university when in fact some people are literally categorically not allowed to come into your space? Or if you were to go to Shanghai, for example, there are things you can say and things you cannot, and you better be aware of that. So I think that I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I am sort of thinking about citizenship is very tricky, as are rights, and the two don't always necessarily go together.
And I think, I think I'm sorry. Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question about meaningful to who, right? Because I think when we look at the state of this country, and I'm just gonna talk about, I can't talk about everything, right? I certainly think we would say the state of this country would suggest that our citizenship does not mean what we thought it meant or may not. But we would be in denial if we said that American citizenship doesn't, or Americanness doesn't matter globally. It does. The denial of the rights of many kinds of people, right? LGBTQ plus people, Black people, Asian people, has not diminished the sort of American hegemon, right, globally. So it is meaningful. What it means to you or to others in the communities that you're involved in, or people that I know in my community, no, it doesn't mean much. But I think it would be a mistake to say it doesn't matter. Now, to the second part of your question, right? And I think this is where Dr. Johnson piece becomes really quick about who gets to be a global citizen, because some people are choosing to walk, right? And saying, I don't want to be in this place anymore, or choosing to divest, right? You have Black women trying to create a Black town in Georgia, right? Saying like, we want to divest, even though they're still in the US, right? We don't want to participate. And there are levels of ways you can do that, right? Like, you can't quite be a sovereign citizen and not pay your taxes. And get traveling.
Right.
You can try it if you want, you can ask us. But there are people who do choose to step back from that, citizenship, right? So I mean, I think the meaningfulness part probably needs to be parsed a little bit, but I think where you're going is, I think where people are trying to get to, which is sort of normative place. What should it mean
Right.
if you're going to call yourself a nation state? And you're going to say, we have these people that we say are part of the republic or the body politic, right? The polis in the most direct sense. And we have multiple parts of them out. I think the question we also need to ask is, isn't that how the state is designed?
Yeah.
Right, so if that's the case, then the state is working earlier. So.
Yeah. I think that's it. It's a fantastic question. It's vexing question. And both your responses make me think about what the state and citizenship means both subnationally in a way and supranationally, right?
Yeah.
Because even as you're saying, Dr. Carter, those say Black Americans who say, I can't do this anymore. They trade on their Americanness when they go abroad seeking some sort of relief from what's vexing them here, right? And then even subnationally, right? When you go to the local level, right? There are ways in which what was possible in the examples you gave from your project, which again sounds fantastic, were possible because of their ability to leverage their access to the nation state for certain kinds of resources. The problem is that citizenship status becomes less precious to some people, I'm thinking whites here, when the boundaries of it expand, right? And what you get is a backlash, right? Sort of taking certain kinds of rights away. I mean, you talk about social citizenship, political citizenship, economic citizenship, and the way in which those levers are pulled at different times to make it stingier, narrower. I mean, on and on and on. When at those moments of real possibility, I think one of the ways in which Black citizenship is a powerful concept, it allows us to think about the possibilities because it underscores what's missing, right? It underscores the Elijahs, what's not there. And so we can sort of reimagine citizenship in a more capacious way, right? The problem is to get there, you have to deal with these exclusions, right? Yeah.
So there was a movement of Puerto Ricans who were renouncing their US citizenship, and they would have to travel to another country like Venezuela. I don't know, was one place they went often. And you had to go outside of the US to renounce your citizenship. You couldn't do it in the US. And then they would, see how they could get back in. And so it was a kind of legal play that they were doing to see, okay, well, if I renounce US citizenship, what am I, right? Because they would renounce it without adopting a Venezuelan citizenship or anything like that, but they would keep their Puerto Rican driver's license. And so try to participate in local elections, etc. And so they were trying to push to create this kind of category of legal residents of Puerto Rico without being a US citizen. And so I think that speaks to the question that we see, that I would love to hear more like the need that folks in DC feel for a state, right? I think that there's also, this idea, we think so much about the nation, but there's all these other levels of states as well. And so in Puerto Rico, the local state is a very significant one. And something that, there were proponents of statehood in Puerto Rico in the early years when Puerto Rico became part of the US. And at that point, the vision of the US, was very different from what it is now. At that point, the US was imagined like a kind of EU, a kind of union of sovereign states. And so a lot of the folks who supported statehood at that time, their vision of the United States was of, newly freed colonies from in England, creating, a union in the Americas. And so, I think that aside from thinking of other forms of citizenship, we have to think of other forms of nation, federation, belonging, interrelationship as well. Because those, this idea of just getting a piece of paper that's going to give us a set of rights to what is a messed up institution, is something that maybe we have to rethink that, what it is that we want to belong to.
Oh my gosh, so many questions. Are you down to choose someone? Me? Okay, I guess I'm choosing. I would
Hello, my name is Wendell Marsh, assistant professor in Africana and English here at Rutgers-Newark. Thank you all for a very stimulating discussion, and I guess I have an observation that I'll try to turn into a question somehow. But across your various presentations, one thing that comes up repeatedly is the colonial question, most obviously with Puerto Rico, but even with the opening of the land acknowledgement, but also of movement, thinking of the Great Migrations and the classical internal colonialism thesis, right, or even occupation of American cities as being a colonial question. And when we do that, then I think of two things in particular: the question of Black sovereignty, right? And so I would be curious, as political scientists and anthropologists, how you would think about the question of Black sovereignty today in the world, in a global framework. But then the second thing I think about when thinking about the coloniality of this discussion is the question of military imperialism. And the way that historically in the United States, participation in the kind of American military complex has been one of the primary mechanisms by which citizenship and the privileges of citizenship has been granted, right? To think, two examples come to mind, which isn't historical, it's contemporary. Our Secretary of Defense is a Black man, Lloyd Austin, right? But also after January 6th, a Black woman, Yogananda Carter, was put over as the interim head of Capitol Police to, take care of things after chaos broke out, right? And so this relationship to American imperialism, to occupation, to American colonialism, of whether African Americans, West Indians who become naturalized or otherwise, is consistently the way it happens. And so, in particular, in my mind, something happens after 2003 in the Iraq War that seems to me, and I'm not a political scientist, I don't have good evidence for you, that there's something like a bargain of citizenship that becomes pronounced by participation in the war on terror specifically. And I wonder if the silences that you identified, Dr. Rogers, around the question of Haiti and like this inability or unwillingness at the level of an agenda around Haiti is part and parcel of the bargain of participation in America's wars.
Wow. And that's so since you called me out. Question.
I'm just thinking with you.
So we're thinking together. I love it. I love it. No, it's a great question. And I think embedded in it is, I think, a welcome critique of, I'm thinking of Chris Parker's work, on Blacks who served in the military. And this notion that participating in the military, if I'm getting the thesis correctly, actually radicalized a lot of these Blacks, in fact, in terms of the kinds of injustices that they were expected to accept at home while the country was waging this war against, totalitarianism and all the rest abroad, and yet Black people in this country were laboring under a kind of racial totalitarianism, in fact. And so what you're saying actually turns that on its head. And I find that really interesting, but it's also the case, I believe, that Blacks and other people who have lesser standing have always paid the price for American military adventurism and all the rest. That is absolutely not new, or even just poor people, working class people who, not just people of color, have often paid that price. And it's almost a price for admission to a certain kind of standing. And yet in the end, it's just not all it's cracked up to be, as several of us have been saying. I haven't really noticed what you're describing, but it seems to me like it jives with a recurrent pattern. I don't know that it's new. I think that we've seen that, and that's always been a part. What I find really interesting in thinking about American militarism is also American militarism in the global South, particularly parts of the Caribbean and Latin America, and the way that that has actually transported certain ideas about race and certain racial categories and what they mean and the power that they've come to hold. Like, I have a wonderful graduate student with whom I work, Michelle Bueno Vasquez, who's studying the Dominican Republic. And that's one of her theses. In fact, she argues that the whole idea of sort of mestizo or cosmic race was a way to actually ensure a more secure relationship with the United States during the period where they had a great deal of influence on the Dominican Republic. And in a way, they replicated the anti-Blackness right there in making that move. They could have gone 1,000,001 ways, but that's what was chosen. And so I think that's another way in which we need to think about the role of the military in how it's related to this idea of Black citizenship globally. Because I think the reach as far as you're suggesting in your comment. Yeah.
Can I just jump in? So I want to follow what you were saying about the role of the military from another perspective, which is I have my colleague Cristina Beltran, who talks about the ways in which Latinos are brought into this sort of carceral security state, and that it doesn't radicalize them left, it actually radicalizes them right. So she talks about the rise of what she calls this multicultural conservatism. And so I think it kind of can cut both ways. And I think even when, the sort of research that's been done on African-American men who are Trump supporters, the connection between the military and the sort of carceral apparatus is like pretty close. But I do want to sort of think about 9/11 as this, what we would call an APD, a critical juncture. So in New York City, there is huge growing protests against what we now would call stop and frisk and police brutality. 9/11 happens, it is done. And it doesn't really come back up until 2010, 2012. And so I think there is a way in which that bargain that you talk about really derails a lot of activism around sort of policing and carceralization. We don't get the sort of new Jim Crow Act in 2010, right? So there's a whole, I think, of the lost decade in which the sort of 9/11 bargain just kind of shakes things up. And I also want to talk about, just really briefly, Colin Powell under this rise. I mean, they're very complicated figures, right? And one can't even imagine a sort of a Colin Powell and a Condoleezza Rice emerging. I mean, there might be new ones, but like the way that sort of configuration, I just can't imagine it happening.
It's such a good point. And along with Cristina Beltran's work, I think it's so interesting because there's a newer study by David Cortez, where he does some ethnographic work where he follows and lives with Latinx ICE agents along the border and how they're actually selected for their Latinxness. And he finds roughly what you're finding, but a lot of these are Latinx people who still live in these Latinx neighborhoods and find themselves under some pressure to justify the role that they're playing in sort of social control for the state or worse, right? And what's interesting, and some of my students have been dissatisfied with it, is the argument that some of his informants or respondents make is that they only took the job because it was conduit to mobility, economic and social mobility. But your question is so spot on because it said you pay a price for that, right? I mean, your point, Dr. Johnson, about the kind of inculcation and certain kinds of values that might happen. So when we're talking about, and Chris Parker's work is talking about the military at a particular historical conjuncture, very different than the period you're talking about. And so I can see why you could get very different outcomes in terms of what radicalization looks like at these different historical moments, for sure. Yeah.
Little bit of biography. So my dad was career military, served in Vietnam. And I remember him coming home, and he's like a country boy from Indiana. And he came home with, like, I remember a Black Power wristband.
Yeah.
And if you had ever met him, like, no, but like that was, I always sort of think about that, like the ways in which, you know, he goes to Vietnam, has this experience, and comes back for a moment, kind of radicalized, and then quickly lets go of that. But
And wither Black sovereignty?
Oh, so the current part of the question that we left off, but I think, everything, it is, especially to, and it's the one in Western Lamari and 140, looked at kids in the Rio Grande Valley in particular, the way they are tracked, particularly Latinx kids, into the military and into these other, because they can be, even though on all metrics, they look college ready as their peers, right? But they are pushed into this. So there's some evidence to what you're saying. And then for dreamers and other undocumented people, military service can be a conduit to citizenship, right? So that's also very disheartening, right? The way they incentivize this particular space. But Black sovereignty today, I think, is always an interesting question, because I think we see these moments, right, of these communities popping up, Soul City in North Carolina and Nicodemus in Kansas. Like, we have all these examples of Black people attempting to do something that looks like divestment. And I think capitalism is always kind of one of the things that undermines it. And then, of course, white supremacy, right? In the case of Soul City, you had Jessica L saying, I'm going to see to it that this thing failed, right? It was Soul City, it was a planned community in rural North Carolina with the idea of having economic infrastructure built into the city. It was going to be like manufacturing mostly, but it also had a healthcare service that still exists. People can get things like dental care, which in those parts of the world are very few and far between, but also they had a pool. I used to swim there as a kid. It was the only pool that you could swim in as a Black person, because all the other city pools got filled in because of integration, or they privatized it. So when you swim, and it was supposed to be this sort of playing community. And I think about Black sovereignty. I mean, it's a hard one, right? It's to use, well, that's it, right? Because even in places where we see sovereignty, right? I mean, you have the continent of Africa, right? 50+ countries that are sovereign, but people still have to fight over owning mineral rights, right? Things that would make that continent very rich, in countries on that continent very rich, and still having to fight with it. I mean, even people who say they're doing sovereignty on the continent, where his city was going to come up with a currency that was going to compete with the host country's currency. Like, oh, right? Like, why would you do that? That's terrible. That's a bad idea.
tell us what you really think.
Look, the people say whatever, they built nothing. So there's that. But I do think that's something, to this point about imagining possibility. I don't know that in countries that already exist, that are European led, right? White led, let me not say European, white led. Whether that's going to happen. Right, like, I get it, I know that there are people who there are always gonna be some form of agreement, right? There are always gonna be people who form their own kinds of communities of faith, you just don't wanna be bothered. But you're gonna have to participate with white people on some level. So I don't know that that's possible here or in the UK or in France. And even on the continent, because of neo-colonialism, I don't know that that's possible. But I do think it's worth imagining, thinking about, and at least trying to, right? Like, I think it's a worthwhile project, right? To Dr. Bonilla's point about thinking about what does a citizenship look like that is not exclusionary, that is sort of not place-based, that is not race-based or about maybe what language you speak or other. Like, I think that's what Black sovereignty and Black projects around sovereignty have always been really useful for, is thinking about what does the world look like if we could be exactly who we want to be without none of the other stuff, right? Like, if race didn't matter, right? Or if who your embodied person was didn't matter, what would that look like? So, you know, I don't have a satisfying answer to the Black sovereignty question, because I think there's so much encroachment, right, on those spaces that are trying to, like, I am really curious to see what happens. I think it's freedom, right? Is the title of the city in Georgia, the Black women are trying to build. I think that's really intriguing. I'm really intrigued by the Black farmers out in Colorado. Gosh, I'm blanking on their name. Who are facing all this harassment, right? But they're like 6,000 acres, like a clean amount of land in Colorado. Not saying it bad, but I'm just saying it's a lot of land. And are facing this harassment. And I think about them as a potential sort of like modern example of Black sovereignty. Because I think they moved from the Carolinas to Colorado for the express purpose, right, of having that freedom and that peace and that, you know, to be farmers. And are facing all this harassment. So I don't have a satisfying answer for that, but I think Black sovereignty is not something to give up on. I would say it's probably gonna be a marathon, not a sprint, to something that looks like Black sovereignty. But I don't know, I mean.
I'm gonna be all political sciencey, talk about favor. And you know, what is the definition of the state? It's an entity that has an monopoly on the use of force. And so when I think about the vexing problem of policing, is that for all of these attempts at Black sovereignty, at the end of the day, Black people don't control at the local level. They don't control the monopoly on the use of force. And when they do, often they replicate, as we saw in Nashville.
Yes, yes, yes.
So I'd like to think about Black sovereignty, but at the end of the day, I'm very mixed, disheartened, because I think not the sort of means of control of violence. That is the difference between living in kind of a peaceful, generative life versus one that's not.
And there's also a replication in how property are conceived and constructed. So it's the use of force and how we structure property rights, right? And oftentimes we see the failure of the imagination when you get a replication, right? Because I think subnationally, you can point to, I mean, Dr. Carter gave us some great examples and numerous examples of people making an attempt at doing something that looks more independent, that at least flirts with Black sovereignty, but oftentimes using the master's tools. I mean, there's kind of same old models, and it's a real problem. And I think one way to get beyond that is to think more globally, right? Think about experiments that go beyond sort of a monopoly on the use of force, that go beyond property rights in the way they're understood in sort of strict capitalist terms. I think that it seems to me that would be the next frontier for those kinds of experiments. Yeah.
So in my work, I push back on poverty and wonder if we might want to rethink this imperial concept that we've inherited, because, you know, sovereignty arrives as a concept as, you know, supreme authority, supreme right over land, right over human and non-human beings, and it's inherently tied to the imperial, you know, project. And so for me, Black sovereignty would be either maroon sovereignty or non-sovereignty in the sense of not that kind of sovereignty. And I would, rather than thinking about this right to conquer and settle and dominate, right, how do we think instead about Black entanglement, Black relationality, and other forms of being in the world that aren't holding sovereign
Are there other questions? We had no time. If there are one or two students, so we're the two students, and of course, Dr. Edmondson. Yes. Any students?
You've been really nice.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. This has been like a really riveting conversation. I have the privilege of being a student in Professor Miller's interdevelopmental studies course. There are three things that come up for me, in particular as a person who for the last 22 years of my life, I've been working in politics in Essex County, statewide, East Orange, Newark cities that I'm very well versed in. But there are three things that really struck me: the point of migration, colorism, which I think is something that has been mentioned but hasn't been talked about deeply, and then also like the policy, right? So the beauty that I get to experience being with scholars who are anywhere between 25 and 20 years younger than me is listening to what their experiences are in the world, particularly the scholars who are native of the diaspora, who are here from Ghana or Nigeria or other cultures. And one of the things that I pay particular attention to in what they say is, I did not know what being Black meant until I arrived in the United States. In Africa, we're not identified by a color. We are identified by our tribe, our nation, different things of that nature. It's not by a color. Black is a color. So I come to America and I come to school and I hear Black, right? So what that says to me is there isn't this understanding of and it's part of the reason why I do not identify as an African-American. I'm not African-American, right? To me, the definition of an African-American is an individual who has a conscious knowledge of why they left the continent to come to the United States. My ancestors did not have that level of consciousness. They were taken from the continent, did not know why, rhyme or reason, and brought to this place to do the labor, to do all the different things that you all have mentioned today. So my question is, as you are like digging deep within the various points of research and projects that you all have going on now, to what extent are you including the voices in considering Black citizenship and this notion of nativism versus foreign born? To what extent are you considering the experiences of the folks that come here from the diaspora or from the Caribbean, et cetera, as part of that conversation and grappling of what their experience is and their observation of Black America? And then also, how are we also getting deeper into the story and the pathway of migration in a way that foreign-born and native-born are making this connection with each other to get at changing the policies that need to happen?
So I would say that's a great question. Thank you for the. So for me, at least, my work was expressing about Black Americans. We don't actually talk about them as political scientists, I should say. Black Americans are actually not often talked about in the conversation around immigration. It's not a Black issue. So my work wasn't about folks from the diaspora to the US. It was about how Black people think about this issue, right? And so I did do interviews with those people. To the other part of your question about how do you get these people together, to think about themselves. I mean, one of the things that I think we're getting better at, I can only speak for political science, I think anthropology and others have been long ahead of us as a discipline, right? Is asking people those better questions about who they are and where they come from and who are their parents and how they identify and, you know, even think, who are you married to, right? Are people marrying folks from the same country, folks from the same continent or the same region of the world, or folks marrying, you know, Americans or others, right? And so I think as we've been doing better work of that, I think we have a better understanding of who when we say Black, right? In terms of pulling people together, and I think this is Dr. Rogers' point, at least around the issue of Haiti and why that issue is not on a larger Black agenda, I do think there are still ways to go in both directions, right? I think Black Americans dominate what we would consider the political agenda and the political conversation in the US. And sure, there are regional differences, right? You brought up New York and other places, but in general, right? When you say Black people in this country, people assume you mean people who were born here, and maybe not people like even Dr. Miller, right? Who may have a parent or parents were born in other places and are first generation Americans, right? Use that language. And so I think there are moments that we can see and things that we can point to, right? We can think about South African divestment movement, right? We can talk about those early 1980s protests around Haitian detention, right? There are moments where we do see the diaspora working. And I do think, I mean, one of the things that's encouraging about young people is culture and the way that culture circulates, right? When people talk about, you know, Wale, right? Wale is from PG County where I'm from, but Wale is a Nigerian person, right? His parents are Nigerians. Or we talk about Burna Boy, right? Sold out Madison Square Garden. He's a global superstar that most people know at this point in some way. So I do think, I mean, not to say that culture is the only bridge that we can make, but in terms of awareness, I do think there was more of an awareness now than there has to be. But, you mentioned nativism. I mean, part of my work is about that, right? That, I mean, I think we talk about it as if, Black people are all on the same page. I'm using Black people in the big Black sense, right? And the big Black, and we're not, right? People have different issues. People have different concerns, right? I mean, in where I'm from, there are lots of Ethiopians, for example, and that the unrest that is currently happening in Ethiopia was huge in local elections. Right? People don't talk about that part, right? Oh, Black people don't vote for Democrats. But when you look at what happened in Virginia and other places, there's at least some anecdotal evidence that part of what happened was that Ethiopians were upset with the Biden administration and either did not participate or defected, right? From the Democratic what do you call this? Coalition. That's a favorite word, right? And so it does matter, to your point. I would also just say this, when you talk about like people not recognizing they were Black in the way that we use the term here so easily. Globally, when you look at the skin bleaching industry, that is an indication about what your color is at the very least, and what's acceptable in terms of complexion. And that is huge in Asia, it's huge in the Caribbean, it's huge on the continent. So yes, people may not have a recognition of their Blackness in the way that we use here, but people have a recognition that color matters and that lighter is better. And that is not confined to a particular place. The global anti-Blackness and that skin bleaching premium is huge in the world.
Okay.
So I'll leave the final comment to Dr. Edmondson. She raised her hand before.
I'm not right. This has been such an awesome panel. I'm just happy to be listening. The question I have to ask, but let's open up another sort of can of worms, which I'm not going to do now because I know people need to eat and to break. But my question was actually to return to Reuel Rogers' comment about reparations, and also piggybacking off of your comment about nativism. I believe you said you think that the conversation about reparations has become too sort of like about capitalism. But a lot of, when we talk about citizenship, we are talking also about resources. Who has access to resources? I think, Kim, you asked, can you be a citizen without rights, or have rights without citizenship? But a lot of this is about who has access to resources. The reparations discussion has sort of taken off in the United States. I was amazed to see a discussion of reparations in Congress. I think this is something that came from the bottom up. But speaking as somebody from the Caribbean, I always thought this was not an American discussion. I first heard the discussion of reparations in the Caribbean. So to me, it was always about colonialism.
Yeah.
It's about what is Europe prepared to pay for what they did to Haiti, for what they did to Jamaica. This was always the discussion. So I always thought of it as an anti-colonial discussion. So to see it in the halls of Congress made into an American argument, I'm not saying it's not something I support, but it seems that it changed, it shifted, and it became about becoming an American, like you owe us. And that has also spawned a nativist, a Black nativist movement, the ADOS movement. Some of you may have heard of it. It stands for American Descendants of Slavery. In other words, at the very moment where maybe Black people in this country would get access to resources based on the heritage of enslavement, and what all the deleterious effects of that is at the moment where people say, well, who's Black? Who counts as Black? And I think that's actually an important conversation because it's affecting discussions of affirmative action, of who gets into schools like Rutgers. And as much as we want to have a more utopian and wide idea about what citizenship is, when it comes right down to it, who gets the money? As somebody once said to me in Jamaica, when you get the money, you can check me, right? So that's what I wanted to ask the panel. What do you think of the reparations movement? It's a radical moment that we are at in some ways. On the other hand, is this just another part of a kind of capitalist conformism?
Yeah.
Should we ditch the discussion of reparations altogether? I think some people would have a problem with that.
Right.
So that was what I wanted to ask you, but I know we're out of time. So I don't know if anyone wants to bring that up or we should save it for the next.
One little thing. Sorry. So each person can get 1 minute to respond to that very easy question. Okay.
So reparations was on the agenda, 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
This is like a memorable, but like it was there. And secondly, ADOS is interesting. I wonder about disinformation campaigns and social media. There's a paper that's been retracted, but I started following Garrity and the comments. It was like Trina 5689 XYZ. And like there's a lot of churn going on, a lot of bots. So not to say that I think it's that reparations is now global. That I think there's a US strain and there's a non-US strain, and that the two are finally kind of really coming together. But I do really worry a little bit about the sort of social media disinformation part of it.
And it's clearly had some effect. It's such a huge question. It's really good. I like the idea of thinking about reparations in a more global context, because what I found in the Republic of Evanston, where I teach, is that for all its sort of, I think, heralded progressivism, the notion of reparations, and it's the first municipality in the country that's really made a concrete effort. It's boiled down to home ownership.
Yeah.
It's a very cramped notion of what, and in fact, it reinforces certain kinds of inequalities. And so that's what I meant when I was talking about it, how it's been moderated in this American context, this is one place, but you've seen it even in some of the discussions within Congress. How, again, the narrowing of the contours of what reparations were, and so I found what you said about the discussion of reparations in other places really useful. And I think it's a pity that that isn't informing more some of the discussions we're having in the Republican events and elsewhere. So that's what I was getting at.
There's two reparation conversations that I'm following. One is in California, where they're doing like different kinds of accounting and thinking not just of descendants of slaves, but also people who have been impacted by the carceral state as you know, needing reparations. And then in the group that I'm running on decolonizing Puerto Rico, we've also trying to think about reparations, because that's never been in the conversation about Puerto Rico's decolonization. And part of what we're saying is that we don't want to just think about the harms done to Puerto Ricans, but also about the benefits that the US is reaped from having colonies. Because we feel like that's always silenced and never talked about, and that asking for monetary repair might reinforce stereotypes about the welfare state and, you know, all of this. So that instead, what we want to think about is the benefits that the US has accrued. And we're also trying to think about how can we shift between anti-colonial being anti-imperial.
And I just want to make one final comment about reparations. Within the US colonial context, the US Virgin Islands, there are communities within the US Virgin Islands that are not looking to the US for reparations, but are looking to Denmark for reparations. So what does it mean that they don't see the US as responsible for their ownership for 100 years, but that they hold Denmark accountable for what has happened to the US Virgin Islands? So that's also another complicated piece to this whole reparations discussion. And with that, thank you.
Welcome to the panel on Black citizenship and religion. Really looking forward to this one. We're going to look at the question of Black citizenship in the context of religious and spiritual communities. And we have an excellent panel, and I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Reuel Marsh, professor of Africana Studies here at Rutgers-Newark, and take it away, myself.
Thank you, Belinda. So this panel is Black citizenship and religion. I think there are a number of things that connect with the last conversation we had, in particular, the question of autonomy, right? So Black religion both as a concept and set of distinct traditions has often been thought of as the space of autonomy within Black communities, right? Scholars, early scholars such as Benjamin Mays, when he's writing about the Black church, one of the things that he identifies is this characteristic that the Black church is this space where Black communities can be themselves and to develop social institutions, right? And even more recent work, thinking of someone like Judith Weisenfeld, who's has the concept of ratio religious communities movements, thinking about how at the turn of the century, religious movements in northern urban cities are spaces in which the kind of major categories of social life are disrupted, interrupted, exchanged, negotiated. And so religion, and there are many different ways we can think about that as a concept, as the scholars of religion will be able to guide us in that, is a way of both reframing the question of belonging and citizenship, but also to think about certain aspects in the political conversation that might be overlooked or missed. And so we have a group of 4 distinguished scholars with us today. Dr. John Jackson, professor and dean of Annenberg College of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm just going to mention one work that I think is especially pertinent to our discussion today, Thin Description, Ethnography in the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem from 2013, which is both a great work of scholarship on kind of Black religious communities and also just a really sophisticated work of anthropological theory at the same time. We also have Dr. Todney Thomas, who is now at Yale as associate professor at the Yale Divinity School, and is the author of Kincraft, The Making of Black Evangelical Society, with Duke. We also have Dr. Zain Abdullah, associate professor of race, religion, and racism in the religion department at Temple University, and also a former professor here at Rutgers-Newark. Welcome back. He is, of course, the author of Black Mecca, the African Muslims of Harlem. And we also have Dr. Carlos de Sina at Rutgers, New Brunswick, who is a professor of Latino and Caribbean Studies and of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And he is the author of the recent works, Circuits of the Sacred, in which he investigates queer life in kind of Caribbean religious communities as well. So we have a great group of scholars who study different traditions, religious spaces to help us think about the questions around Black citizenship. And so what we'll do is we'll start with Dr. Jackson. If you could kind of introduce yourself and your work, especially as it relates to the theme of Black citizenship. And then you'll have about 5 minutes, and then we'll also get those introductions from everyone else. Let's start with you.
I'll try to project if it's not on. There you go. Hope what I have to say is worth hearing. Maybe that's the thought of the next introduction. So I guess what I'll say is part of what drew me to the study of the African Hebrew Israelites, you referenced as one of the books I published. It's the same thing that keeps me going back to 19th century mesmerism, occultism in Black cultural communities like Pastor Randolph, and even my growing interest in trying to think through communities like Seventh-day Adventists and their Caribbean and African American side in the US. It's the sense that part of what I think has been so, for me, incredibly intriguing about all of those kinds of projects, especially the Israelite Rastafari, another version of this particular dynamic, is first and foremost their explicit denunciation of the very framing of religion. They're not religious, and what they practice isn't religiosity in the ways in which they would argue other folks imagine it. They would have different ways of explaining why they would push back against that formulation. And we can talk about some of that. But I think part of what also becomes to be really important is when you look at the kind of work that all of these communities, especially the Israelites, try to do under the auspices of their own spiritual, cultural, and they would argue sort of nationalistic ethos to reclaim a certain identity that was purposely hidden from them. It is about the project of trying to reconstruct a sense of, I think, what we would use citizenship as a proxy for, like being members of a particular kind of political order that is about control over the world and over one's place in it, including how you conceptualize your place in the world. politically, culturally, socially, existentially even. And so there's a version of that project that to me undergirds a lot of what we think about as what drives not just the Black forms of religion, but the ways in which we sort of occupy this space, this category of religious identity, such that, you know, in the US, we often talk about in political terms as being important to separate church from state, right? Church being the kind of standard for the ways in which we understand our interfacing with invisible principalities, principles, and ideologies, and personages that maybe aren't here, so that we imagine there's some control over what is here. And so I think part of what I'm always drawn to is the fact that even as a kind of hyper-rationalist project, the Hebrew Israelites, they cannot be more committed to the scientific understanding of their alternate version of Black history and Black cultural life. That they do this in this sort of wonderful tandem with kind of what I would argue are these amazingly fertile, but also sometimes quite dangerous, irrational, and commitments to things that aren't proven and provable. And it's sort of navigating that line effectively. Clearly that I think our entire political discourse is trying to but that also some of these things have found, I think, really deft ways of mobilizing, such that some of their most important goals are if not achievable, then at least put within a line of sight that allows them to imagine the steps to take to get to their version of a finish line or a promised land. And so that, for me, is part of what continues to draw me to communities that I think straddle this really interesting commitment to both a clearly reasoned approach to understanding their place in the world, while also recognizing that that reason is always going to have maybe tucked in through the back door, but certainly in ways that are undeniable. This kind of interesting commitment to all the logic of irrationality of logic. I think we often need to imagine more. So that's some of the kind of concern.
Absolutely, thank you. Next, we'll hear from Toddney and Dr. Natalie Thomas.
So, I work on two different communities on Friends of Kincraft. I work on a collaboration with an Afro-Caribbean and African-American evangelical movement, right? So you have sort of mixed Black congregation and association. You have evangelicalism, which is both units politically. We have Atlanta, which is a kind of Black mecca, right? The idea of a kind of socially mobile Blackness, the promise of that. And so, one of the things that I think about what my work has taught me across that book and my current work on Black church arson is we have way too much meta-narrative standing in the way of us actually getting to know each other as right? And one of the things I really like about ethnography is that it's small story research, right? It requires actually asking people, what do you think is responsible? Who do you think is responsible? Who is your kin? Who are you related to, right? And going with the numerous kinds of responses that come out of those. So you have Black evangelical community in Atlanta, shaped by Plymouth Brethren-ism. This community starts with an Afro-Bahamian evangelist moving to the South, right, the Bible Belt South, to start Bible Believing Church, right? So you already have a Caribbean man moving against the grain of migration. Most Afro-Caribbeans are moving to major cities. You have African Americans who are leaving the South to that. And so you have the beginning of a very unconventional story. The idea that the kind of Christianity practiced in the South is apostate, not real evangelical. And the story remains interesting as that. One of the things that Black evangelical and this community that I did work with taught me is that all evangelicalism isn't civic religion, right? The kind of evangelicalism that we know very well, which is about white supremacist imperialism and creating moral and institutional infrastructures for the spread of US ideas about capitalism, about heteronormativity, about US imperialism and supremacy. All evangelicalism don't do that work, right? If we think about it, if you have a Black an Afro-Caribbean man coming to the United States, he has an idea that US evangelicalism is flawed. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. So this sort of founding evangelist, T. Michael Flowers, goes on the record and says this thing that evangelicalism, you know, about God bless America, God doesn't save nations. Right? And this family values stuff that kind of comes up, he's like, you know, some people are making their family an idol. Right? So you have, you know, Afro-Caribbean and African-Americans relativizing some of the major strands that we know of, sort of evangelicalism, and really sort of teaching me that there are evangelicalisms that are not civic oriented. And that doesn't mean that evangelicals that I collaborated with weren't voting. I did research in 2008, which was like, literally I was doing field work before was elected. And one of the sort of, you know, we had this idea that evangelicalism, and even Black church Christianity, we had this idea that the Black church is kind of an Afro-Protestant Democratic Party machine, right? All Black churches aren't overtly political. Right, it was taboo to talk about political ideas from the pulpit or directly, right? Now that didn't mean people didn't talk about it. There was coded language. So in Bible study or prayer meeting, you know, two women were very close, right? They were prayer partners. That means they call each other and pray every morning at 5 a.m. Right? Which, listen, was not a book deadline. Nobody could into anything. So, you know, so these women are very close. And at one point, one woman prays and says, Lord, you know, we need someone who's going to replicate important values, right? I kind of nods and became. Prayer partner says, Lord, we need someone who's going to initiate the changes our country needs to see. And not to Barack Obama, right? So what's also important to note that even within a sensibly conservative religious movement, there's political variability, right? And I think that when we hear the word evangelical, I think we have an idea, we know what it is. Map it, we can plot it, you know, we know who they are, we know how they vote, we know what's important to them. And I think small story ethnography, I think particularly it's important because Blackness has two, it's not something that's lacking representation, it has way too many, right? Small story ethnography really allows us to kind of move past these meta narratives to see not just nuance and complexity, but how people show up, how they tether race to religion, how they don't tether race to religion, right? And I think there's also kind of sense in the West that a lot of these projects go together, right? Like religious movements or racial movements or religious movements, and that's not always the case. I also think that my research with this community taught me, and the last panel talked a bit about, I think, interracial distinctions in Black identity politics, you know, and so another kind of popular story is that Black immigrants and US born Blacks are competing, right, for economic prosperity, right? And there's literature, I've read the sociology literature, you know, on Black ethnic identity formations, about certain preferences, hiring practices, about ideas of a dissident native Blackness versus more conforming immigrant Blackness. This stuff is actually not hold up at the level of reality at and so there's also, you know, I think a need to really think through some of the categories of meta narratives we have about Black ethnic identity formation and how different Black communities come together and inhabit and share space and share organization, right? So my own research sort of showed me that there are definitely ethnic distinctions, right, between Caribbean and African American evangelicals. There were definitely cultural ideas about immigrant versus Native experience. I was misidentified as Caribbean, right? Like, oh, you're a nice African girl getting her education. And I was like, well, I'm nice, but I'm Southern. You know, and to the credit, like, it's not like people stopped talking to me about it. But you know, there's definitely ideas, right? Only people compliment and all of that. At the same time, people are very protective of their community story. So when there's ever any evidence about sort of ethnic tension, and I would ask direct questions, people were very committed, right? So there's a way in which we have, there's competition, there's conflict, these things are inherent, right? The lines are drawn. But if unity and community and family weren't valuable, people wouldn't try to protect it. right? And religion, and in the case of this community, spiritual kinship, the obligations that members have to one another became a kind of intra-ethnic alterity, right? One of the things I also noticed in doing this work, instead of a distinctly, immigrant experience versus US Black experience, that a lot of the members of this association were chain migrants, right? Whether they were African American or Afro-Caribbean. They had lived in at least two places since their place of birth before making their way to the next, right? So one of the things they shared was having highly mobile life experiences, which I think forces us also to think through when we look at communities and our categories, what kinds of shared experiences or processes are we missing, right? What do our boxes and categories hold, and what do they obscure unless we evolve and ask different sets of questions? Right? Another thing that I noticed in the discussion of ethnic discord or intra-ethnic community was a real concession that white supremacy and imperialism, right? So if we think about evangelicals as like very conservative people, who vote Republican and they're GOP, and they are sort of progenitors and reproducers of US imperialism, we would not then find critiques of US imperialism as well, right? Which is once again why on the sort of ways in which religion comes with citizenship means ethnography. In terms of my current work on Black church arson in Knoxville, I'm looking at a sort of local Black community in Knoxville who deals with arson and the ways in which they are thinking through a kind of Black intramural set of relationships, right? It is a project that looks at clergy and young activists talking to and kind of past each other. But it's also very clear that there's not a real trust or investment in the state as right? So an arson happens, arsonist isn't apprehended. This happens 5 days after the Emmanuel 9 occurred. Right? So over the course of several years, I asked people, who do you think did? Who do you think is responsible? What social forces are responsible? And in many ways, people turn the discussion to arson to talk about policing, to talk about gentrification, to talk about the actual litigation about the police finding someone who did it becomes very inconsequential to people. And there's a kind of lack of trust in sort of mainstream statecraft in finding that, right? Like Black people are thinking about other social issues that accompany this arson. And thinking about the state as in many ways another propagator of violence, right? Just as whoever burned their church propagated violence, the state does that as well. So I think we need more stories about Black religious communities, right? Aside from the kind of monolith of the Black church as a democratic political machine. This is also John, a Seventh-day Adventist community. So, Adventists have different ideas about investment in contemporary moments because the end of the world is coming, right? So really investing in the state and like state bureaucracy finding solutions that doesn't necessarily fit a worldview in a particular kind of way as well. Not all religious movements think of the here and now as significant, right? And so, yeah, very different communities. But I think even within the umbrella of Black Christian, there's a lot of variability that forces us to think through and ask questions about race, about politics, about religion.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Hyacinth.
So, I think I come at some of the questions from a slightly different place. Justice thing. Yeah. I don't have a religious studies training. I don't have that background. My training is very much in sexuality studies, queer studies, particularly queer LGBT. My first book is about Dominican immigrant, gay and bisexual men in New York City. And I came to this project in a way that sort of flips the scenario because in 2013, I attended a Black Transnational Feminist Retreat in the Dominican Republic. and the retreat opened in a Yoruba led house in Santo Domingo. And my path to initiation is Anthropology started in that on that trip, or at the end of that trip, if you will, because I wasn't sure what I was doing. So I initially thought I was writing a book about Santeria. Yeah, that's what I thought. This has happened to me with the two books. I think the book is something, and then the book shows me that it's something. And what happened was, it took me quite a while to pull it together. Once the more quote unquote academic chapters came together, I did something that I always do when I arrive at this phase of writing, which is sort of sit down and do an inventory of like, where am I at? Because I need to finish, right? And in the process of doing that inventory, my first sabbatical, and God knows how many years, I realized that there was something that there was a lot missing there. That something I did, which was a very specific decision, was I decided to get initiated in Santeria in Havana. So in order to write this book, the way that I felt that I needed to write it, I ultimately refused the ethnography of Santeria. There are plenty of those out there. As you know, those of us in religious studies, and those of us who know about Santeria Lukumi, there are 20, 25 books, some of them classics in Caribbean anthropology. But I thought, well, I'm not gonna write those books because I need 20 years in this religion to actually say something, to feel like I can actually say something authoritatively. But I can write from the vantage point of a queer man entering this space as an initiate, and what my encounter with Blackness in that setting set going for me as a Latinx man, particularly as a Dominican American. And so, so what I wrote really is the book of somebody who's in queer studies, who is entering this other space, where word on the street is, you know, LGBTQ people are well received, well accepted. That's sort of the word on the street, right? But the moment you start looking at the literature and you talk to practitioners, you realize that there is a lot of it's more complicated. You know, certain positionalities allow you to advance in certain ways in the religion, to get consecrated in some ways and not others. So, you know, the plot thickens. But one really important moment for me was when I was in the thick of my initiation ceremony, having a reading, which is called an ita, where you get the cowrie shell speak for you. So all the gods basically wipe the floor with you because they're going to tell you things about yourself that you didn't know anybody knew. And some of them did wipe the floor with me. But the officiating priest who was sitting with me, who had not ever met me before that day, said, this religion was made for people like you. And so I said, I'm in Havana. I'm in the outskirts of Havana. I'm in the thick of this life transforming process. And I began to think, wait, because I'm gay, because I'm Yuma, which is foreigner, like which part of this is a religion for you, you know, which part? When I walked away from that, and as I reflected on that and many other very small moments in my path to initiation, I realized that what I really did want to write was about the non-spectacular moments of realization, about self and identity, but also about this path through this path toward achieving a measure of connection to that which has been forbidden in my very identity construction as a subject. I'm a 1.5 generation immigrant in the Dominican Republic. I arrived in the US when I was 15. The first time I went back to the Dominican Republic when I was 18 or 19, I got a Mellon Mays fellowship, and I said I was gonna go, I guess, evangelize about being gay in the DR. As 18-year-olds are likely to say. And I arrived and I realized, wait, why is everybody so Black here? Didn't realize that my psychic infrastructure had been constructed around the notion of whiteness.
Yeah.
That did not exist, that did not conform to the bodies that I saw on the street. So even recalling the person of my childhood, I was confronting that cognitive dissonance. For me, that's really, that became a real linchpin of how I came to grapple both with Santeria Lukumi and with the processes through which I came to compose a life, the life of a quote unquote successful, upwardly mobile academic. So the book that I ended up writing attempts to grapple with all of those parts. By actually narrating my connection with, specifically, I'm thinking about James Baldwin, but he's not the only one, African-American writers and artists who, in one way or another, helped me articulate a sense of self or language of being and belonging in this country at a time when I could not explicitly articulate a connection to Blackness because that had been denied to me from the very beginning of my identity formation. As a Dominican, I come from a very colorful, as in skin colorful family. I happen to be one of the lighter presenting ones and one of the more successful ones. So for me, the process of thinking through the implications of finding the divine in that site of interdiction in my process of becoming and self-destruction was actually paramount. So I talk about in the book, I begin early on to think about what if God is a black hole? Both black hole as in WHOLE and black hole as in HOLE, as in Evelyn Hammond's definition or conceptualization of black holes as being all around us but invisible. What if the God, the Olodumare, the maximum deity in Yoruba cosmology, what if it is that black hole, right, that surrounds me but that I can't see? And so this project has helped me kind of reframe a bit of what I'm doing in this profession in a fundamental way. Of course, we all want to eat and feed our families and do all this other stuff. But I've increasingly become preoccupied with a question I ask my students a lot. What kind of ancestors do we want to be? And I think of it because I oftentimes have become increasingly preoccupied with knowing that, or wanting my books to be read by those fat little queer boys like me, so that they can see that somebody else, walked the path before they did. So this project, this is the book project, the Circuits of the Sacred. And then I'm in the process of working on a new project with a Taino composer, healer. She works the Taino tradition, but also in very strong dialogue with indigenous healing traditions in North America and in the Americas. And it's called Healing Fusion. So I'm looking at her music, but also the healing work that she's doing. Definitely thinking even more about this question, the kind of ancestors we're looking to be ourselves.
And finally, I have Dr. Diane Lush, who's doing as very up.
So what we're doing, we're just setting up some images. In addition to being an anthropologist and religious studies scholar, I'm also a sort of visual studies scholar as well. So I work with film, right now I'm working on a film PBS series on Muslims in America as well. So I work with visuals to create another language or another way of seeing that I think that sometimes we miss. I think sort of a visual culture can answer questions, I think, that we can't really find in the ways in which we try to like to locate the text. So you go through that stuff. Okay. All right. So I wanted to start with this image of hundreds of thousands of Africans leaving Africa, getting on small boats that are not seaworthy, trying to reach the Canary Islands, trying to reach Italy, trying to reach Spain, looking for a different sense of freedom. We talked about freedom, or a different sense of citizenship. But the citizenship that I think we should talk about it involves transnationality, a kind of transnational citizenship, not just a national one, right? So for them, it's about going somewhere else, not abandoning your family back home, not looking for a different place to be, but an extension of yourself, right? So when I talk about transnational identity or transnational migrants, I'm talking about people who want to expand different spaces, different places, not just be identified by back home, wherever that is, but home could also be somewhere else. So for instance, in Haiti, President Aristide in the early 2000s set up something he called the 10th Department, which means that in Haiti, there are 9 departments, meaning 9 districts in the island. So he realized the power and resource of all these diasporic Haitians immigrants that were in Miami and France and other places. And he said, I want to label you a 10th department, right? You're not in Haiti, but wherever you go, you're bringing Haiti with you, right? So he realized also that the kind of territoriality of it did not matter. It wasn't about the geography, right? It was about how you carry Haiti with you, right? And how you also have to maintain a relationship with the continent, with the country. So this image is striking for me because you find Arabs and Africans on this boat, hundreds of them, leaving out of Morocco. They might leave from Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, or where have you, and leaving those ports in Morocco and Tunisia and other places, trying to make it to what they think success is, right? So prior to working on this book, Black Mecca, I really wanted to do a book that it was around this idea which was called the transnational imagination. Is how do we understand how people imagine their migration before it happens? And what kind of strategies, household strategies are sort of negotiated and configured in a way that actually would allow them to fulfill what's in their imagination. So the idea was to go to Ghana and work with the Asante and the Asante people of Ghana. And actually I learned a quantum tree to prepare for my trip. Unfortunately, I didn't get the Fulbright grant. So I said, okay, plan B. And plan B was to instead of going to the continent, to Africa, and understand how migration is configured there, let me stand on this side, stateside, in Harlem, and find out how they're coming into Harlem, right? And that gave me a whole other set of questions, right? But with this, though, I think what's important about this image is that it kind of sets up a different way of thinking about citizenship, about thinking about belonging, about thinking about what it means to, in other words, go somewhere else, as many immigrants were trying to do. You grab the golden fleece and you come back home successful and say, look what I have for you. Why would someone risk their life traveling on the ocean in a small little fishing boat to reach somewhere they thought would give them the kinds of freedoms or successes. It reminds me of the Elian Gonzalez case, right, many years ago, where a mother coming out of Cuba puts her son on a small little boat to sort of weather the ocean to reach this place called America. What's in your imagination? Where do you think you're going? What do you think is there that will force you to say, I'm placing my life and my child's life on this boat to get to this place? Well, one of the responses that I had from these trans migrants, or transnational migrants, was that they said, I'm risking my life so that my children and my children's children will have a chance in this world, will be able to be successful here. They did not find that opportunity in their own place, their own country. So for me, stateside being here in the US, the questions were about, well, if you arrive here, how do you negotiate and navigate what it means to be Black, or race, ethnicity, and religion? How do people negotiate those multiple identities? So that was my question. My question was about belonging and negotiating. What does it mean to be Black? Not only what does it mean to be Black, but when does Blackness matter in that process of negotiation? When does ethnicity, someone being of African descent, matter in that process of negotiation? When does it matter to be a Muslim in a particular situation? So the ethnography that I constructed, that was done over about a 5-year period, was to follow 3 African groups around Harlem, meaning that you have the Malinke, right, of Cote d'Ivoire, you had the Wolof of Senegal, right, and from Guinea you had the Fula. But not only did I want to follow them and find out how they process race, how they configure what it means to be of African descent, meaning Black immigrants. And how did Islam matter to them, and when did it matter? I also was hanging out with Black Harlemites and trying to find out when these Harlem residents also figured the same thing. When was it in sort of collaboration? When was there contestation? And so trying to unpack this entire process gave me a sense of identity as sort of situational. It also allowed me to see the various places in which identity mattered. So I looked at parades. I looked at certain events. I looked at being at various masjids, mosques. And I looked at just hanging out on the street, on the apartment stoops, trying to understand what kind of conversations were coming up at those points, right? So what I want to do, go to the next slide, Roberta, thank you. Yeah. So in trying to understand this, I want to understand migration, what I call mainline assimilation. And this is the kind of way of thinking about migration theory. This person here is Sadiq Abubakar Wahid. As you can see here, the flyer on your left is when he first started to enter American politics. This is, what date is on this flyer? Yeah, 2001. Now, he runs for office for city council September 11th, 2001. And so the council district 35 is Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a place where many immigrants from Ghana and Nigeria, and especially later on from Francophone speaking Africa, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and other places where they began to migrate. It was Brooklyn first before Harlem. So he runs in a place like that because he figures that he has the African support, the African immigrant support, right? He doesn't win because of September 11th. Right? But here's a person who actually is trying to assimilate into American culture, meaning mainline assimilation, means like straight line assimilation, meaning that he wants to be embraced as a regular politician. You know how people say, I don't want to be a Black artist, I want to be an artist, right? So he doesn't want to necessarily be an African politician, he wants to be a politician, right? That mainline assimilation. Now here you see, 2019, he becomes the ambassador from Sierra Leone to the United States. So here's an individual who comes into a society, right, looking to actually assimilate, right, fully, and he makes it after, oh God, how many years? Over 20 years, right? About 20 years. He sort of makes it into that mainline part of the society. The next slide. Now, this is interesting because where Sadiq Y is from Sierra Leone, and he's a Sunni Muslim, a classical sort of Muslim. Here, Keith Ellison is from the Nation of Islam and a Black Muslim, but he also enters politics, right, to become a representative of the House. But this is considered a multicultural assimilation. And instead of swearing in, taking his oath of office on the Bible, he gets the Quran, which of course, you know, really was just explosive, right? A lot of backlash, right? But whose Quran did he use? The Quran of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson owned a 2-volume Quran, not just owned it. We know that he studied it closely. Right? His initials are even in it. Right? So Keith Ellison swears in a Black Muslim from Detroit, Michigan, right? Ends up in Minnesota. But he runs for office and he wins, and he holds the office from 2007 to 2019. Now, his assimilation, his sense of being a part of the nation state is from this multicultural identity in place. Right, so he's coming in there from a Black Muslim perspective. He's not trying to be like everybody else. He's not trying to become white, but he's actually entering white spaces, and he's negotiating white spaces, but he's doing it as a Black Muslim. The thing that struck me in Harlem, and the years I did research in Harlem, was that many Black residents of Harlem, longtime residents of Harlem, did not recognize the Islamic identity of their African Muslims coming in. They weren't even sure that they were Muslim. Now, Islam has been in Africa for centuries, right? Right. They're coming in with their robes, with the different imars and all these kinds of Islamic paraphernalia. And yet, the Harlem residents are asking me, they're Muslim, right? But the Islam they recognized was a different Islam. They recognized the Islam of Malcolm X, of Muhammad Ali, of Elijah Muhammad, of Louis Farrakhan. They understood that the nation meant Black dignity. It meant Black resistance. It meant something else. So the African one they didn't get. So we can go to Harlem and think that, well, they understand that they're Black Muslim, but they really didn't get that part, right? Now, next slide, please. Now, what's interesting about Ilhan Abdullahi Omar is that she comes out of Somalia, right, as a refugee. So the first slide I presented was about the forgotten. Let's not forget what it means to be a refugee in America, not just an immigrant or a documented immigrant. Let's talk about refugees who are actually on the rise all over the Western world because of these kind of migrations and this exodus out, right? but also even immigrants that come in who are undocumented immigrants too, which is really huge as well. It's not everyone doesn't come here documented. And as one fellow told me, when I thought he was some naturalized citizen, we were going to the Elizabeth Detention Center to look at these Africans who were detained. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but they were detained, there were 14 detained. And I brought a buddy from Senegal with me, and he says, yeah, you're a citizen, you know, so he's okay. But then I noticed he was getting nervous as we approached the building, right? The detention center, right? I'm like, you seem kind of nervous. What's going on? And he says to me, I said, you're a citizen, right? He said, oh yeah, I'm a citizen. But it's how I became a citizen that I'm afraid of, right? So when we finally left the facility, he grabs my arm, he says, I just knew they were gonna come, so we got you. You know, because it's not the fact that he became a citizen, but it's how he became a citizen. Paperwork, documentation. I don't know if we talk about it enough in terms of citizenship, immigration, paperwork, spurious, right? And so how we get it, what's legitimate, what's not legitimate. What I want to speak about briefly is this collage of images of Ilhan, right? Is that you see how she's dressed, right? In different ways, right? On the bottom, she has the traditional Muslim hijab on, right? She's wearing that. But then on the top right, she has a turban on. What's got kind of very Afrocentric look with the necklace and this kind of thing. Then she has a more modern look right to the left with the braided, you know, like the head wrap is on there. What I want to say is that this illustrates for me that we need to pay more attention to various kinds of Muslim orientations. This is not one way to be a Muslim, right? And so you get one individual who's sort of exercising different expressions of herself, even though she actually has embraced this notion of being a Muslim, an African Muslim here. Now, this is what I call segmented assimilation. This means that you come into the US as a foreign-born individual. Your parents may have come here before you, right? But they did not gain assimilation or any parts of assimilation because usually of language barriers, class barriers, or any other kinds of ways that you prevent it. But then your children might not as well because of the same kind of cultural barriers you hold on to, the language you hold on to, right? So it might not be until the 5th generation that you gain some kind of access, right? So segmented assimilation means that each generation doesn't quite get there, right? So we have the 3 kinds of assimilation according to migration theory. Right, we have mainline, where someone like Sadiq Y sort of works his way in there. He kind of gets into mainstream America, becomes an ambassador, right, from Sierra Leone. Then you get this multicultural assimilation, where you have someone like Keith Ellison, who actually sort of on his own terms enters the political arena and establishes himself as a Muslim candidate or Muslim representative, right, of the House. Then you have Ilhan, who actually comes from this refugee status, right? She has some refugee status, but she also is actually sort of tethered to communities that actually don't have the access that she has. That they're prevented by language, by culture, by all sorts of things. And they might not gain access, full access, maybe until the 5th generation. Right? So I just want to so end here. Thanks. Yeah, I want to end here by just saying that my work then started out on the continent, but then had to shift as a result of lack of funding to actually be working from the U.S. base, meaning that I became a nativist, as they call nativist anthropologist. Meaning usually anthropologists work somewhere else. Right, and the anthropologists who actually work and study their own culture are oftentimes not also accepted or accepted sort of equal footing as others, even though that's changing slowly. And John, I don't know if you would agree with that, the idea that those anthropologists who don't go abroad to kind of work on their projects don't oftentimes get the same sort of acknowledgement as those who do. But I think that's really changing. But for me, though, working in Harlem was extremely fruitful because I got a chance to work with 3 different African populations, and then also work with longstanding Harlem residents to see how they got along. Where was the conflict, right? And what does that mean, especially around notions of race, ethnicity, and religion. Now I'm working on a book that looks at the Nation of Islam in Newark, New Jersey. I've been working on this book for a while. And now I'm looking forward to doing this next sabbatical in the fall, writing the book up. This book really is about how the Nation of Islam in Newark, temple number 25 in Newark, during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Yes, I did say 30s because there were Nation of Islam members in Newark in the 30s. Most people think it started in the 50s, but it actually started as early as the 30s. I finally have proof of that now, right? But how Black Muslims in this space, how they were involved in the Black freedom struggles. The idea that, there was sort of a lack of freedom in the South and freedom was won in the North needs to be overturned to realize that Black people were fighting for freedom in the North too, right? What we call the Jim Crow North, right? But also the idea that the Christian-based way of thinking about things, civil rights, it could be overturned as well. We need to understand that the Islamic way of thinking about things as well also played a major role in the way in which Black people were involved in the Black freedom struggle. So,
thank you so much for that. There are a number of things that we hear from these panelists that met the discussion, and the previous panelist discussion, in particular, thinking about the question in documents and how there's almost a limit case to think about citizenship with recent documents and ways in which they're included. You're not thinking about citizenship or not. But also, there are 2 things that have come up within this panel that I find interesting. One, the kind of value of ethnography and small stories to kind of get at some really kind of micro level questions about kind of people's experiences and motivations, right? So thinking about the religious as really a way of thinking through kind of motivation and internal discourses and conversations people have with themselves. And then also just last theme that maybe I heard, especially from the last 2 presenters, is children and things we do for children or put differently ancestors and more generally kin, right? So that's something I hope you might dwell on a little bit as we go forward in the conversation. For the sake of time, I know we kind of got a little bit started a little bit later, but I want to go ahead and kind of just open it up to the audience, and if the panelists have questions for each other and want to kind of respond to each other, we can also do that. So maybe we should start with their initial responses of the panelists to anything that's been said, and then from there we can open it up.
I'll be very brief and say I'll respond to and Joseph. I don't think it's anything better like yes, they won't take off. Yeah. I want to respond though to your noting this discussion of ancestors and children and in general, and say part of what two things I found interesting about racialized. One is that their commitment to being racialized meant a certain sort of disconnection from a sense of that. Like them, you know, they're incredibly committed to a rhetoric of anti-whiteness, but they're also anti-African. So their contention is to being Israelite is different from being Hamite, Cushite, Ishmaelite, Haggereen, and it means they have a diaspora, but it's not an African. So them policing that in Harlem, Chicago, in all over the world on 5 continents, like that. Really bad. But they're also at the same time a moralist. That is to say, their project is about getting our species back, they would argue, back to the capacity we once had in Adam and Eve's time to live forever. And we're built to live forever. They think the science is catching up with them now. At the cellular level, right, we can do it. And so part of what they need is a reconceptualization of what it means to think about as power. So when you go to the community, visit them in the bars of the Israel, you'll see, you know, 19, 20-year-olds on the playground. Like, when we're going to live longer, right? Then you can be a child for them. And that is, so the project, really the project about we configuring a sense of kinship, right? And cultural ethnic identity. And thinking differently about sort of the lifespan and how we understand what it means to be committed to a project that really redefines fundamentally what we are as a species.
You know, it actually kind of, it speaks to the way the Nation of Islam also was concerned with life. And so Elijah Muhammad's book, Eat to Live, right? And so how do you prolong the life with the understanding that actually we could live a lot longer than we do. But also the nation's political notion that they wanted a separate state, right? You know, that, and also the fact that Africanity did not really resonate with them as much as well, right? So for them, it was really a kind of Islamic identity more than an African one. And they were looking at Mecca as the place of sort of homeland, right? But I think what doesn't get unpacked a lot is the way the Nation of Islam constantly talked about the separation of church and state, right? Or just having a separate state. And Elijah would often say, well, we want to say like 3 states in the US, we want 2 states in the US, we want we want a separate state. And so maybe we can sort of play with that idea. What does it mean for Black people to create a sort of separate territory within the United States? As someone mentioned about sort of Soul City, right? This is Floyd McKissick's project. What does it mean to have this kind of independence linked to land, right? But this is what was the nation's main kind of thrust, is how do we sort of prepare ourselves for that by eating better, living longer, but with the expectation that somehow our freedom is going to come by being separated from the white majority.
I actually wanted to chime in on that was a good thing here, the theme, because the process of initiation of the other me is a dramatic revisiting of your of rebirth and childhood. You become a child, and in fact, you become aligned in religion, and hierarchies are set depending on your time from initiation. So your chronological age is not the age that matters. It's how long you've been initiated. And that determines if you sit at the table, who's your elder, who salutes you, who do you salute. One of the things that my madrina used to say was that the morphology of the body changes. That the morphology of the body changes. And that's because when you get initiated, you become a sibling to everybody who has ever been consecrated to your deity. You become a sibling or a relative to everybody who belongs to your iled, your house, right? And you become a sibling to the stones that are consecrated along with your head, because your head is treated as a stone. So there's some really kind of extraordinary reimagining that goes on in these circuits. And so one of the things about that I found really interesting in this discussion is that perhaps we've been using the frame of citizenship to talk about something that Black people have always done, which is exceed the given parameters of belonging. We've always been out there. We've always been excessive, right? We've always had chosen families, right? And that, as, entering one of the things with that Cuban told me that this religion was made for you, I thought, what if if I own the you as the you queer person, right? What would we do as queer people, as queer Black, brown folk, in the project of making this for people like us who have been exiled from traditional religious environment, to actually take ownership of the space, I say, and claim it and claim it as we are brothers and sisters and all the rest. And I actually laughed when I was hearing your comment about the sisters who were going at it politically with each other, because there are fierce battles about form in these communities. When it comes to ritual, the fight is usually on when it comes to form. It's not about the outcome, it's actually how you get there. And so it becomes this sort of political brawl. And sometimes people will actually have to do sacrifice because somebody got the form wrong. And you got to go back to somebody godmother to get that sorted out. So it's a really kind of fascinating reformulation of some of the questions that I think we've been asking.
I think also thinking about, citizenship and inheritances versus what are the lexicons and grammars of relationship that Black people choose when they think about intersubjectivity and connection, right? And if you look around, like kinship is a chosen language, it's an operative language, it's an appealing language, right? See that in immigrant communities, you see it with susus and practices of reciprocity. I don't like the term victim kin at all, right? Because it belies the idea that the arbitrations of which will are authentic exist outside of right? Whereas kinship is made through ethical norms and practices and adjudication. Like my son created an uncle. It happened from below and it happened top down, right? He has one New Haven, right? And I saw that process happen, right? And I could have introduced the idea, but he came to it on his own, and there are practices and all of that, so I think it's also, even as we think about excess, like a lot of this conversation like focuses on the political nation state, but I think about these other, even extraterritorial spaces, the spaces that are created by relationship. What are the grammars that Black people choose when they think about their connections to each other? And I think kinship is such an interesting one. I think it's an abundant one. I think there are many different types. I think there are many different social locations, queer locations, religious locations, migrant and mobile locations that make kinship language and the desire for kinship greater. But I also think of it as a kind of alterity to people who navigate different kinds of disinvestment in statecraft, right? Like even when Black people weren't allowed to bring their families, like on plantations, like legally they were denied kinship. They still, they named children after them. They created ways of commemorating family members they insisted, right? And so I find that attractive. I also think, there's a way we can think about Christianity and evangelicalism and heteronormative family. And there's no better way to say this than this. Just something so Black about having relationships, right? When I moved to Atlanta, I didn't have any family. I had a cousin who died shortly after I started my field work, like a heart accident. And so part of the reason I got incorporated into the community, and it was mostly a Caribbean community, was we have a young woman here. And that was like an ethical and moral and existential crisis, like all hands on deck, young woman with no people, right? It wasn't like, oh, field work coming here for like a contrived, that this is also a statement about personhood and people need, right? And I love these arbitrations of relationship to forms of statecraft, right? That likes to sort and whatever. Like the fact that I wasn't the fact that I was African American and not Caribbean didn't obviate the fact that I still needed and some of our identity categories miss some of these existential moments, right? These existential moments.
I think Belinda.
First of all, I just want to apologize. I missed the first part of the panel, and John, I didn't speak first again to say. Actually, I'm very interested in the question of Black nationalism as a form of book. I'm very interested in the concept of Black nationalism as a way of entering into citizenship, specifically with regard to a religious identity and practice. And I was thinking actually of the tail end of what I heard John Jackson saying about Black Hebrew Israelites in Israel and the Nation of Islam. So I'm thinking of a few things. I'm thinking of Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Clay, claiming a certain kind of identity as Muhammad Ali when he joined the Nation of Islam and instantly became a hero in the Islamic world and to Black people. And so he entered into a certain kind of citizenship. But that was because he was claiming Islam as a Black identity, not necessarily as an African identity. Then I'm thinking also, again, I'm thinking of the Black Israelite religions more broadly. I'm thinking of Rastafarianism in the Caribbean, which I think is a form of an Israelite religion, i.e. religion that places Black people at the center of the Bible, and sees the Black people as part of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? But when we think about when that began, that was in a way a response to the colonial condition of Black people in Jamaica in the early part of the 20th century. And so again, Rastafarianism is claimed as a kind of Black righteousness in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I think of that as a very important part of Caribbean freedom struggles because they saw Black identity as a sacred identity, right? Like the mystification, if you will, of Black politics into a Black religious identity became very important to claiming a kind of citizenship. So now that I think of, again, I think we were talking I'm thinking of a slightly different version of Black Hebrew Israelite, but in the news, many of us have heard about Kanye West claiming to be a Jew, the basketballer. These are all connected to a form of Black Israelite belief, which is also connected to national and a kind of Black nationalism, which also rejects, well, I shouldn't say rejects, but does not emphasize an African identity so much as an African American kind of identity. So I was wondering if the panel could speak to the ways in which these particular religious communities enter into American citizenship, because it seems to me, or in the case of Rastafari, enter into a Black citizenship that is very Caribbean or diasporic through a kind of a resistance practice through religion. That's how it seems to me, that these are political identities just as much as they are religious identities, and they are community forming. So I'm just going to sort of leave it open. Maybe perhaps, John, I know you've done some work in this area. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you for the question. So 2 quick comments. One, well, I'll just make a clarification. The Hebrew Israelite landscape is incredibly varied. So the group that I studied first in Harlem were decidedly anti-African, whereas the group coming out of Chicago was a hot house for a lot of things about the body and all this question. The group coming out of Chicago that first ended up on the West Coast back, but then in what they geographized as Northeast Africa, the modern state of Israel, they identify as African. And their commitment is to thinking about and examining all of the Israelism throughout the Africa. Their concept. And so I will say that's part of what makes this such an interesting sort of concoction of different approaches to, and often conflictual designations of a certain kind of community. Because some say what it means to be an Israelite means you are part of a larger African Israelite community. And others say it's right now. And I think, so what I'll say is that community in Israel, they've done such a fascinating job of trying to walk this issue, where, over the years, they've done things like very publicly renounce their American, because they want to stay in Israel, and then they don't want to be deported. So all these elaborate denunciations of American. Whereas at the same time, leaders in the community have done an incredibly good job over the years of keeping the lines of connection open. Congressional Black Congress getting money from U.S. Congress to build schools for their kids in Israel. And so that's interesting to step, it's just kind of another way to talk about this political landscape. And end by saying, and this may be the flip side of your question. I always think of sort of Devin Carbado's articulation. He's talking about the difference between American citizenship, law professor, American citizenship and American identity. And the argument he's making is to become a fulsome American from any other part of the world, if you have access to and a capacity to disidentify from African American, that part of what you're able to do is you're able to recognize that the American identity writ large is predicated on something that far outstrips the kind of nearness of American citizenship. That for Black folks, citizenship is relatively easy of late, right? But this sense of American identity is about recognizing that to be fully recognized as American means to be committed to a project of denigrating Africans in the US. And I always think that's an interesting way to just say, clearly the stakes of citizenship projects are important, but he wants to recognize the fact that it often means different things, different views, and different parts of different points in time. And I thought that's a sort of nice way to think about why it becomes really central to recognize the version of what it means to be American. That is not reducible to what we think about, strictly speaking, as I think Americans is a natural object.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, as it pertains to the Nation of Islam, what's interesting, I think, is that the term Black Muslim was sort of given to these members of the Nation of Islam. In fact, Malcolm X often would say that he tried to, as he said in the autobiography, dislodge that term Black Muslim. And then he would say that we're Muslim, but we're Black people, but we're Muslim, we're not Black Muslims. Right? This is what he says in the autobiography. So what's interesting is, again, even though there is this promotion of Black dignity and Black excellence and that sort of thing, but they want to be perhaps ontologically, right, Muslim, not Black, right? And so, but in the media, popular culture, members of the nation are identified as Black Muslim, like those two terms go together. One qualifies the other. But in the nation, that wasn't what they were trying to do. They were trying to interrogate race as something that circumscribed people, that's something that oppressed people. So this is why they would not want to embrace a Black anything. But they recognized, though, that calling themselves Black was better than calling themselves Negro. I mean, I think the first way of distancing themselves from this kind of system of exploitation was to what? To get rid of their last names, like Malcolm X, right? To sort of X out that lineage, that heritage, go back to the ancestry, right? And they would argue, probably before many people, that Black history begins before slavery. Right? So they're Xing out the last name and saying, that's not where we begin. We begin way, 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 way back. Right? And so I think the political strategies of the nation around Blackness, around heritage, is something that doesn't get talked about enough. And this is part of what I'm doing in the piece that I'm working on, is trying to sort of be able to sort of foreground their involvement, but also their commitment and their contribution to Black studies and to the Black freedom struggles, right? That we oftentimes don't acknowledge.
So perhaps we could maybe collect 2 questions and then we just answer. We have the microphone here.
Hi, everyone. This is amazing. I love this panel. So I had a question about how the concept of future or futurity works in relation to this efforts towards citizenship, or even at the nexus of religiosity, right? If you don't believe that there's a future coming, how does that alter this desire for citizenship, or even the projects that are worth pursuing in terms of kinship, getting on a goal for your children's children, you kind of have to believe that a future is even possible, right? So if you could talk a little bit about futurity and futures and how that plays out in the different spaces.
Let me just collect one more for the discussion.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I think I'm gonna actually ask the first question, not future, but past. And thinking about the ways in which some religious movements, Safarian, which is Islam, where slavery in West Africa has come up, well, no, we don't want that. We're going to do this flight away from it. And sort of create this alternate sort of history.
Alternative history.
Versus, Santeria and even evangelical, where like West Africa and slavery is very much part of it. Like you cannot do this unless that is part of how you think about worship. And so I'm just sort of struck by this kind of where, this disaster, like this rupture is being handled in these different religious traditions.
Okay, so the past and the future.
Yeah.
I'm starting to brief. In terms of the future, the part of the question about what time scale. Right, so, and just two quick stories, one future and one past. So when the Hebrew Israelites, the first group, sort of hobbled their way from West Africa to Israel, they got there before the Mashiach arrived, first people, and they started the process of symbolic conversion. I think they could not sustain the claim. So they said, okay, we're used to bringing in folks from all over the world. Okay, the Israelites can symbolic convert. You can be part of it. When the Mashiach got there, said, absolutely not. Why? Because it says we were to do this, we'd be conceding to the assumption that we're not. And so for him, he wanted to argue he's playing the long game. So it might not mean you get citizenship tomorrow, like when 10 or 20, 30 years. They've only recently begun to have citizenship. But for him, it's about thinking about a futurity that really has quite wide. And I think that's been important for the community, certainly define their relationship to the Israeli state. In terms of the past, I guess the one thing I would say is, the way Hebrew Israelites on both sides, especially on the U.S. side of the Atlantic, frame the transatlantic slave trade is to argue that African and Arab Muslims and African Canadians sold Hebrew Israelites. That's a clear, that's how they sort of think about their diasporas being sort of an indigenous diaspora throughout the Americas, but it includes sort of every indigenous community in the continents in the Americas, but doesn't include Africa. Because they admit that this history happened, but their argument is that the ways in which the folks who were chosen and plucked from Africa and put on those ships, the way it was determined for the function of them separating out people. That's kind of them to alternative version of history, but trying to make sense of that past in relation to their kind of reimagining of representation of the present.
Interesting because there's a lot of dialogue between Santeria and Espiritismo. It's actually a tradition, a sibling tradition. There's something called the misa espiritual, which is it's like a mass. But it's a very unconventional and much more fun mass. And the Catholic mass is and I say this former Catholic. and wait, recovery. But in fact, to be initiated, I had to route my initiation through my childhood house. So the part of the healing process involved going like, it involved making peace with that. One of the interesting things when you're beginning to learn to pay respect to the ancestors is you through different divination procedures, you they identify an astral chart, which is an assemblage of energies that attach to you. Some of them may be related to you by blood, it could be a grandparent, a great grandfather, or somebody else, or it could be an avatar, or sort of you know, like I don't know, it could be a runaway slave, it could have been a commission of monks or whatever. Sometimes those connections are not really clear. It's not clear why they attach to you. You just know that when you're in the divination space, the medium can see you, right? And they make the presence. And so there's oftentimes in the mass, one of the officiating folks will experience transpossession. And in the process of experiencing, there's usually like one ancestor that attaches to each person. They're like it's not a guardian angel because your orishas are the equivalent of a quote unquote guardian angel, but it's a muerto is the ancestral figure that attaches to you specifically. And the medium is generally trained to work with this ancestral figure. Now, when that ancestral figure makes their presence known, oftentimes they may make references to the Middle Passage, they may make references to slavery, but they really tend to go to the micro, the more quotidian details. You may see or you may experience a revisit court scenes, but oftentimes it's more like I'm stealing away time to drink a bottle of rum with you all and tell you all the tea about everybody who's in the room. And then I'm gonna leave and this person won't even know that she just wharfed down 2 bottles of rum while we were here, smoking and doing all this stuff. So the approach to the past is definitely eschewing the monumentality of certain kinds of trauma, unless they have specific purchase of on people in the room. Because if something did happen to you, it's likely that the muerto, the medium, will reference that in engaging as a way of kind of validating their sense of they can read your aura, or they have a sense of the depth that you're bringing. So it's an interesting sort of it's a counterpoint. I see it as a larger discourse that is clearly embedded in Santeria practices about remembering bodies that have been born asunder, not just from an origin, but also from the notion of the self as subjects, and you got part of this larger sort of cosmic thing. The futurity orientation to me seems very much tethered to the notion that you know, I remember I was really into these Santeria hats. I used to wear them to planes. They're like hook hats, right? They're old-fashioned hook hats. And I didn't realize that they were hook hats until I got on a plane and some white dude in front of me said, "Oh yeah, you bringing the food or something?" Yeah. And so I had a moment because we saw it cook, right? I mean, like, you know, like I'm giving the guy kind of
Why?
well, because in that moment there was no way that my use of it was not intelligible in space. It made no sense. I was the one wearing this thing, right? And so at that point, I'm just thinking, kind of in shock, but then I thought, yeah, it is a cool hat, right? And then I looked at old pictures of Santeros, right? very busy sort of iconically in the repurposing of imagery that was supposed to be denigrating imagery. How you sacralize that which can be, how you imagine a future in a context where a future in a way is a chronicle of a death poem, right? And to me, I always went back to the hack, right? As the notion that some people may not get it, but it's the magic of it is in the code. So somebody will get it, right? Somebody will read it as, or somebody will see the religious connection. And in fact, Santeros recognize it. So, and they salute one another when they do that recognition. And so in that, I think that's where a measure of purity is true. Even if it's not untethered for character.
You know, the interesting thing about the Nation of Islam is that their story of what's called political mythology, right? Yaqubism. And Yaqub is this scientist who actually played with genes and splicing the genes and creating different races, that sort of thing. So they come up with this kind of political mythology to talk about what happened historically in the past, how we got to this point. Even to say that this is how our hair came, right? Because he was playing with these genes, right? But also seeing slavery as something of an anomaly for us. In other words, we were great, we were brilliant, we were, rulers of our own destiny, rulers of the universe, and there was a cream of the planet Earth, gods of the universe. This is kind of what part of the lore, right? But the other part is in terms of futurism, the Nation is a future this worldly religion, right? So whatever is going to happen, it's not going to be somewhere else. It's going to be here, but in the future, right? And so it is millenarian, right? And so you're looking for a particular time frame which this is going to happen, right? And so in one fell swoop, you get this Yaqub mythology that talks about the past, but also brings the future into this kind of vision of why we're doing all this. In fact, what was interesting, especially before the passing of Elijah Muhammad in 1975, you had thousands, say maybe even millions of members who actually were preparing for that moment by storing beans, canned foods, water in their basements. It would be typical to go into a member's house and go to the basement and they would have foodstuffs all over. So they said, he said, we're waiting for the mothership. That is a black ship, like Star Trek, right? It's a black, so it's kind of futurism. But it was about this, the mother plane, which is part of Ezekiel's wheel, right? But that this thing was going to come and save Black people from white supremacy, violence, and what happened. And people waited for that, right? So it was this cognitive dissonance when it did not happen. 1975 is like, when prophecy fails, what do you do? Right? I witnessed people actually who lost their minds. Would just they were like zombies walking around the street. Because everything was, they bet the bank, right? Everything was on that. And I think that speaks to not, I wouldn't say Black desperation for those kinds of things, but how much we believed in it. Right? And we're willing to give everything, your children, everything up for the possibility of it. I think. I mean, Plato talked about this political mythology. Yeah. I mean, you need a mythology, right? So for creating a vision of the nation that everyone can ascribe to, right? So, so I think that the Nation was interesting in the fact that we're not sure where Yaqubism comes from. The leader, Elijah Muhammad, invented, or did his predecessor, W.D. Fard, who was this enigmatic figure. We don't really, not sure where he came from, but probably South Asia, more than likely, right? but selling his wares in some inner city communities in Chicago, Detroit, and other places. But had a message for these people that no, in fact, he was even telling them like you're kings, you come from royalty, you don't come from right. And so that changed people. I mean, to see what's remarkable about that mythology, it transformed people. I mean, one week you were in the street pimping, and the next week you had a bow tie on and a suit, a white shirt, and you were marching. People I interviewed over and over again just attest to that fact. And I've seen it myself coming up. But to hear testimonies from people who were in the 80s and 90s tell me about this and what it meant for them to be invested in that. It was remarkable to see people just, it was miraculous. And so I think that one, definitely that one political mythology, Jacobism. So melds both of those together, right? You know, how are we going to deal with where we came from and where we're going, right? In this one story, this one narrative. It's brilliant.
Past and future. I'll focus on the Black evangelical and different with Adventists, right? We have very elaborate relationships and prophecy and remnant theology in the world. Also the great disappointment, a very elaborate prophetic moment that didn't happen that changed, you know, in many ways some of the impetus of the movement. So the maturity question for is probably one of the most interesting things about my current research that I'm still reading about. I'm like, well, this is just a different narrative that I'm used to. For the Black evangelical community that I collaborated with, I'd say in terms of the past and the history of slavery, you know, the relationship to slavery was also one that was very much contested, right? So I think that we have histories about evangelicalism, the First and Great Awakening, the exposures and method of enslaved people to Christianity through Methodist and Baptist, you know, conversion efforts and all of that. This community doesn't descend from that tradition, right? This community descends from, it is a evangelicalism that starts in Ireland, right? Is very anti-sectarian, makes it to different parts of the world, but it's not part of the Great Awakening strand of evangelicalism that we know. The movement that I look at, there are other Caribbean people like the Nottingham Brothers. The Black evangelical movement is pretty much started by Caribbean. We do work at the beginning of the 20th century. We're just now starting to get histories, you know, written about this, right? And a lot of ways when I started doing my research, people would be like, you know, I remember I gave a presentation at the Transatlantic University of Black Religion and Race. And we have to think about this idea that Blackness is about religion. It's not. It's not, and the same goes for religion, right? I remember I was giving this presentation and I heard Reverend Jeremiah Wright, you know, for say, who are these people? Right? I was doing my research, right? So the idea that Black Christians are mutually intelligible, that they're all on the same page and they share the same grammar. I did research, interviews with some African American evangelicals that said before I was Christian, I was Baptist. So who counts as a Christian, right? When did your Christian journey begin? Right? You know, and so I think it's really important. Like it can sound very laughable, but it's laughable because we think we know what a Black Christian is. Inside it, we have statistics, and this project broke down a lot of my own socialization about that. There's debates on whether this over who the ancestors of this community are. So much of my research happens in Bible study. And like I took like 4 or 5 weeks. Like it was listen. Yeah. And gotta go. So there's one Bible study conversation where someone says, you know, my wife did her genetic ancestry test, maybe you have your ancestry and you're excited. And then another person says, you know, why would that? And another woman says, you know, we traced our lineage back. My family's from Mississippi, but we were able to find West African ancestry, Irish ancestry. And the person says, well, if you're Christians, why should you care about them? Like our ancestors are So this is me, like, I'm a kinship theorist, like, what is this gonna be, you know, so the contestation of who an ancestor is, who a progenitor is, even within a movement, right, is still something that's very much debated. And Christianity has its own strand of supersessionism, right, about conversion and deracination and all of that, right, which is also part of the imperial project of U.S. evangelicalism. But the particular, we can't lose sight of these particular formations, right? And I think in terms of the future, the kind of evangelicalism is community practices that comes out of like the 1830s in Ireland. One of the founders of this movement, the Brethren, is John Gardner, and he pretty much came up with the major brick and mortar of what we know as pre-dispensation, right? Like the rapture, like these, like people are like, well, how evangelical were they? It's always this disbelief somehow that Black evangelicals aren't evangelical enough. And this wouldn't be everyday people that would ask these questions. This would be religious studies scholars who don't really quite believe that Blackness and evangelicalism can cohabitate. It's sort of like, they would have to like prove, it's like this metric that they had. And I'd be like, they're so evangelical, we went to rapture houses on holidays. You know what a rapture house is? No? Okay, so rapture house,
Yes.
It's really great getting up the Antichrist and the good ones are gonna like left behind, go see left behind. So rapture house, and this is the rapture houses are, you know, set up to kind of model what life looks like after Christians are like the Antichrist has, you know, taken over. Christians who remain are persecuted. There's access to food, people are being discriminated. You know, this was done on like we went to a rapture house on this mega church property. It was elaborate. It was like laid out. You're seeing people being decapitated, shot, right? This is the youth group trip. It's like scared straight. You know, and so that's a version of the future, right? That the stakes of conversion, you know, and so when parents would do interviews, or do interviews with parents, and it's, you know, I did interviews when I was like 25, 26, hadn't been married yet, hadn't had a kid yet. And I'm so glad I took a little bit of time to write my book because I had been married, of course, had a child. And so I heard things I didn't hear when I was like, heard that anxiety and acknowledgement that you don't really know. You can do your best, but you don't really know how your kids are going to turn out. Like, I just didn't hear that when I was 25. So they're doing their best. But what I also heard with that concern about like what's the stake in your descendants is like, you know, this real investment in them being Christians. This idea that evangelicals are rational, they're so concerned with secularism, you know, higher education is a culprit, like go to college and get their faith. But I mean, also there's this idea that like they could be left behind, like you would your relationship to your family, if they're not Christians, right? Then your relationship ends on the mortal ground, the mortal plane, right? And so really the future is trying to have all your families together, like your blood family as Christians in heaven, and your like sort of spiritual family, like they're playing for keeps, right? And that's an ideal future is a future with all your kin, right?
So these have been some great remarks. Perhaps we could take one final round of comments if there's anything left, maybe. If there are any questions?
Wait, where's your hand?
Going on. Going by.
Hello? Can I be selfish? Yeah? Hey, okay, thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Esperanza. I'm long-winded, so I'm trying to figure out ways to do that fast. I guess the first question I have is, you know, like as academics and intellectuals, a part of the expectation in this industry is to translate information with what you know into capital that will make it so that you can stay in this world, right? Like that's, and as people of color, as professors who are people of color, that position is especially precarious. And I guess like this question is coming a little bit autobiographical, but it feels like sometimes to make it, you have to share things that you otherwise don't want to share or investigate. And you have to, and you're straddling this like line of like power and like magic and spirit in ways that are, for me, I would consider dangerous, but beautiful and exciting. And so how do you decide when something is worth incorporating into a thesis? Or when something is saying, you know what, I need to protect this part of what I'm doing, and I'm choosing opacity. I'm choosing to not incorporate this. Like I'm choosing to leave this behind. And then I think like the other question I'm thinking about is, so if it's not obvious, so you know, I belong to the LGBT community, specifically transgender, specifically like kind of like in your face attitude that I have to quell in these environments. Not like this, but like this. You know what I'm talking about? And so as you're thinking about Black citizenship and religion, where do you consider people who are the demons or the witches or the pushed out? And I'm just thinking of like non-normative sexualities and genders. And as a personal stake in it, I'm trying to like read. You know, like it's, I've had to find my own journey, Jehovah's Witness, Christian, Catholic, yada, yada. Like I got rebaptized 2019, and then I got a tattoo of Lucifer, and then I know if you want chapter my kind, okay? And then the other part, and then like the priest like got caught with stealing like 100K. My spirituality is a series of hijinks, but welcome to the trans life, okay? And so I'm just curious, where do you find place for me and the people I mentor and the communities I love?
So thank you for that question. One of the things that I was thinking, when I decided that I did not want to write an ethnography of Santeria because I did not want the voyeuristic experience of sacrifice and the kind of things that people associate with Santeria Lukumi, I did not want to be that to a viewer. The more astute students of Santeria actually avoid this, right? They concentrate on other parts of ritual. They may not write about ritual at all. They may talk about oracular arts and all kinds of other things. So there's a lot to discuss that's not the specular pleasure, like looking at Black people being possessed or sacrificed, or all the other things that sort of feed into a very kind of colonial vision of Black body rapture, you will. You know, to answer your second question, I took seriously what that human said to me about thinking about this path as one that could be made for people like me. And so when the subtitle of my book is A Pragatology of the Black Latinx Caribbean. And I actually think of pragatology as opposite to theology. And that's a very deliberate move on my part, because what I want to draw attention to is the fact that many of us find the most divine in the most abhorred dimensions of who we are. And I'm talking about not just our identities as LGBTQ, etc., but in our sexual practice, that the divine can live in that space as well, that's where we encounter God, that God lives in the flesh, right? Not outside of the flesh, as so many of us have been taught to think by traditional sort of homophobic and sort of body phobic, right? Dogma. And so I think very much about that in terms of my own approach to the work in those communities. or particularly in Santiago for me, which is apparently open, but yet reserved. So in a way, even within those communities, moves like some of the ones I make in my work are heretical. But so be it. I mean, it's a way of sort of entering that to serve a community that is already in there. And my sense is that many minoritized folks in different iterations live in all of our communities, in all of the religious communities that we're in. And they're at you know, there's a love-hate relationship with dogma, but others can speak to that a little more precisely than I, but at least for what I could see, I mean, and even as a, you know, as a former Catholic, I think many of us Catholics, both in outside of the US and in the US, are in this constant sort of struggle to re-signify or reimagine belonging outside of the scriptures of the church, right, which has its own vision of what's accepted.
I think both of those questions were amazing. You know, in terms of the first and capital, I'm like really tenured, like I just like got tenured. Thank you. I'm exhausted, I'm tired. And I have a lot of, I was talking to a former student of mine who's now a professor here at Rutgers, so I'm so lucky. About just all the conflicting emotions I have about it, very long journey. You know, I don't have a lot of regrets though. And I think it's because, you know, I think I was lucky that I got to inhabit the academy. My first job was in the university. So that was very hyper white space. I think it's very exceptional infrastructure of survival for my son and I. That's like we did Black summers, you know, I call it grandma camp. I did research at home, but like literally spent the whole summer there, right? And it was a kind of counterbalance to our life in bonds. I also think about research and who I am as a professor. And one of my colleagues who's a poet named Major Jackson said, you know, you can't share your beloved readings with every class. Right? Like he's like, I don't teach durable class because that's what right? Because the first time I taught a class, I taught eating the other one of my students like right? Like it was, I actually felt safe, it was just crazy. And he's like, you know, be careful of where you teach your sacred text. And also what aspects of yourself you disclose and where, right? Like everybody's not getting every piece of it. Fascinating. And I'm actually pretty open, right? I'm pretty transparent. But I, especially as I've matured as a person, I'm also very deliberate about what aspects of my person I share and where with whom, right? That's about a relation, that's under common thing, that's a relationship of trust. That's, you know, you can have the same syllabus, but who's in the room? Like the classroom is a sacred ecology, and there's some classes that are just you just trust each other. You think some classes are not like that. Some spaces and institutions are not like that. And I think particularly at PWIs, I've had really witchy and really spidey sense about what I can share with and also sometimes ability to be okay. Finally, I think about Catherine McKittrick, who did science, and you know, my second book is about Black church arson and in my hometown, and I've heard some stuff, I've heard some trouble stuff, I've heard some stuff that people would find juicy, you know, right? But sharing the stuff, you know, I have Andro consults, you gotta call your friends, like, because I feel like maybe, you know, and see, my friends are like, oh no, you can't publish that, you know. Now, from a certain kind of white liberal audience, it would like maybe make the book more interesting or juicy. But you know, Catherine McKittrick writes in her science, they cannot have everything. So they've been also very clear that ethnography is also set on relationships of trust, and people can disclose things, and just because they disclose doesn't mean you have to share that with them, right? There are different kinds of you know, in terms of space, you know, I'm not LGBTQ, but I am a single mom. And my journey, I think having a set of perspectives and a tenure person, it was not made for single motherhood at all. At all. Like I have tenure, I'm like, oh, shit is so hard. Okay. Because it wasn't made for Daniel. I used to teach at Harvard. Yeah. Daniel Patrick Moynihan started at Harvard. Right? What the Moynihan for, and I was like, but I think that, you know, the tacit like heteronormativity of the academy has impacts for a lot of people of different social locations. I think the tacit middle classness of it, someone who's recently gone for tenure and negotiated, or people assume you're somewhere else financially, like, oh, your parents can help you with the check, you know, for a house. My mom helping me with the check, so great, I'm just written $600. Right? So people assume intergenerational, it's just, there's so many assumptions that we think, right? There's so many aspects of these assumptions. So when students come into my space, and we have safe space together, I'm happy to speak from those locations, the ways in which the heteronormativity, the middle classness of the academy has sought to erase me. It's not had space for me. It's not been able to account for me. Like I've broken and continue to break the algorithm. Right? And I know from my own perspective what that feels like to be on one side. I know the dissonance you encounter from other people who can't make sense of you. You know, I've had people say, how? Meaning like, how did you write your 2 books? Like, how did you do it? Right? Which is very insulting. But I get where it comes from, right? It's like you're not supposed to, you weren't accounted for, right? So yeah, I think they cannot have everything. I think intentional vulnerability, like what faces you reveal and where. I think radical honesty, like, I mean, I'm weirdly, I'm a scholar of heteronormativity. I know how this shit works. When I'm negotiating, I'm like, don't think. And I study racial capitalism. And y'all think you're not gonna pay me. Come on. I do. Said yeah. You know, if you got aspects of your face, you bring which of your faces you bring, and I think really speaking honestly about those times when you break down. Right, and allow the students who have other social location perspectives to have space to share that as well. The disorientation, also the genius of it, right? Like, because just because they didn't account for me doesn't. I told students, some of us have always been coming. It's not my fault.
Yeah, no, I just want, I don't want to belabor it, but I think we definitely need a panel on this topic. Like, how do you navigate the academy as a grad student and as junior faculty or, you know, various levels. But, you know, I would say it's important to make sure that you understand that not everyone is on your side. I mean, really clearly. That you understand that and not get upset by it. Just strategize. Understand that the academy is that kind of a beast, an animal, right? I remember when I first taught a course at Rutgers here in Newark, and I want to age myself here. 1995, or one person probably knows this. So 1995, I taught a course, a summer course. And I titled the course Racial Formations in the US. I taught it for the Black Studies department here. And that began a 10-year run of me teaching at Rutgers. I needed to photocopy back then, right? Photocopy my course reader, right? Which, you know, big piece of putting all these articles together, chapters and all this. So the dean said, yeah, come to my office and you can photocopy it here. So, okay, if I can slip in and slip out. I'm photocopying, I'm running copies. I'm not gonna say which dean it was. But what was interesting is that, you know, he sort of easily slid over to the copier and started looking at what I was copying. And he said, oh, you're teaching them the real stuff about race. I looked at, I wasn't sure how to take that, right? And I was like, yeah, of course. I wasn't sure, You know, but what he saw was I was giving them anthropological studies, I was giving them studies about science, about history, about sort of sociological case studies, this kind of thing. And he just thought it was going to be, you know, activism, right? And all that. And so just coming in the door, people are going to be suspect of you if you don't fit a certain model, right? And it doesn't matter if you're a grad student, if you're a junior faculty, you're a tenured faculty member. You always have to watch your back, no matter what. I'm an associate professor at Temple University, and one of my grad students revealed to me after he had defended that some people, he said, upstairs brought him up there to ask him, what is he up to? What am I doing? I'm doing everything everyone else is doing, right? You know, but this is after being tenured, after being, you know, it's just a reminder that you can't sleepwalk through it. You have to really keep your wits about you and understand that everyone is not your friend. Listen more than you talk. Listen more than you talk, right? In terms of research, I'll say quickly, now working on the Nation of Islam for me, I had to always be careful about what I'm recording because some of my respondents would say, well, turn the tape recorder off. I'm like, it's off, but I'm still taking notes though, right? Because we're talking, at one point we're talking about how the assassination of Malcolm X went down by people who were there. I'm in the house. It's gonna be YouTube. It's gonna be YouTube.
It's on YouTube right now.
Okay. All right. I gotta see how I'm gonna frame this. No, I understand. Actually, I'm in the house of the person who actually had the shotgun that really killed Malcolm X. He's looking at me while I'm interviewing his wife in Newark. So what I'm saying is that as a researcher, you do have to know what you are going to expose and what you're going to hold for yourself. I talked to a friend of mine who was actually a New Jersey Supreme Court judge about should I even interview people? People came out of the woodwork, wanted to talk to me with all kinds of details. So I had to ask, like, well, should I even interview them? He's like, yeah, get all that information down. But I don't want people to even know that I even have it. A professor called me from Ohio State University to say, can I talk to you about who? Because we were looking at reopening the case of Malcolm. We know that this is actually ongoing right now. This was maybe 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, where a professor called me, you know, to actually grill me about who, and I said, you know, that's not my research. So you got to be also able to say, I don't do that. You know, I do this over here. I could do that, but I do this over here, right? There was Leith Mullins, who was an anthropologist at CUNY, great anthropologist, teacher, educator, researcher, told us in the class once that, you know, she said she had won a major grant to work on Black women in Harlem. And so when she did her research, she collected her data, right? And for her report to the foundation, she gave them what she wanted them to have. But the real critical, sensitive material, she gathered and gave it to the people. I'll never forget that story she told us. You know, so it gave us a sense that, you know, that we have to be careful how we tread. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for these contributions. We're gonna wrap up. Been a great set of conversations, this panel, and throughout the day. Do any of you want to?
Thank you, everybody.